Invisible ownership. Lena grew up in a strict family that didn't believe in ghosts, but was absolutely certain about demons. But her mother was different. She was indifferent to faith and struggled with mental health issues. One night, Lena had a terrifyingly vivid nightmare that she remembers in detail to this day. Lena was lying in bed when her mother burst into her room, screaming in rage. She grabbed Lena's wrist and shook her violently. Lena woke up drenched in sweat, her body stiff with fear. But before she could shake off the nightmare, it happened again, except this time, she wasn't asleep. The door swung open, and there she was, just like in Lena's nightmare. The same furious expression, the same inexplicable anger, the same words. It was as if the dream had been a prophecy. Lena barely managed to push her away, screaming for her to stop. And then, just as suddenly as she had entered, her mother walked away. The next morning, when Lena confronted her, her mother remembered nothing. She looked confused, even slightly hurt. Lena was too shocked and told herself it was just a coincidence, but deep down, she wondered if it was something much worse. A few weeks later, Lena heard her mother screaming from the backyard. It was a strange sound, not a scream of panic or even distress, but of excitement. She rushed outside and froze at what she saw. Her mother stood in the yard, grinning, holding a snake in her bare hands. But the worst part? She had been terrified of snakes her whole life. She couldn't even look at them on TV without recoiling. Yet, there she was, clutching the snake like it was a toy.
Come here, take it.
Mom, what the hell is going on?
But her mother's eyes didn't seem to register her words. She just smiled and tilted her head in an eerie way. Lena turned and ran inside, slamming the door behind her. Peeking through the window, she saw her mother still standing there, holding the snake like an offering, before finally placing it down and walking inside as if nothing had happened. That winter, her church hosted an overnight retreat, a chance for Lena to escape her chaotic home life. She felt relieved to go. Her mother dropped her off, completely lucid, even kissing her forehead before driving away. Around 4:30 a.m., as everyone lay deep in sleep, a loud knocking echoed through the chapel. Everyone sat up, glancing at each other. The knocking moved around the building in an unimaginable way, sometimes seeming to come from multiple directions at once, rhythmic and eerie. No one knew where it was coming from. The pastor, the only one with the key, was asleep in his office and hadn't heard anything. Lena ran to wake him up. As soon as he stepped into the chapel, the knocking stopped. He opened the front door and actually staggered back in fear. Standing there, barefoot in the freezing cold, clothes disheveled, hair drenched in sweat, it was Lena's mother. Her lips moved, but Lena couldn't hear what she was saying. She didn't acknowledge the pastor. Her eyes locked onto Lena immediately. A slow, unsettling smile spread across her face as she stepped toward her. The pastor grabbed her wrist.
"Stay here."
But Lena felt utterly powerless, as if she had no choice but to go with her mother. She climbed into the car, afraid that her mother would do something, but she didn't. The drive home was silent. She said nothing, no explanation, no response when Lena asked why she had come. When they reached home, she stopped at the door and simply stared at Lena, standing silently as Lena walked into her room. Lena shut the door, locked it, and lay awake for hours, listening. But her mother's behavior only grew stranger. The next morning, her mother acted completely normal, standing in the kitchen, happily making breakfast, as if the strange events of the night before had never happened. No one else at the church remembered it. Or worse, they refused to talk about it. That was how people treated her mother back then. Now, her mother was gone, but Lena would never forget. The experience lingered, and the uncertainty of what she had witnessed haunted her long after. For better or worse, she no longer knew if she believed in demons or the supernatural, but Lena couldn't explain what had happened. The echo of the forgotten sonata. Silver Hollow was known for its quiet streets, friendly faces, and a sense of safety. But the highway just outside its borders told a different story. For months, drivers had vanished without a trace, and rumors of a masked figure haunting the lonely stretch of road began to spread. Locals whispered about this mysterious stalker, but no one had seen him close enough to describe. Nick Hollis, an investigator, was assigned to go undercover as a long-haul truck driver to uncover the truth behind these mysterious disappearances. Nick was skeptical. A wholesome-looking town like Silver Hollow didn't seem like the hiding place of a serial killer. He didn't know if the road and the small town were connected, but highways didn't lie, and the rising number of disappearances demanded answers. Although he lived in the town, he had never noticed anything strange about it. Most people were genuinely kind. His cover was simple: a new truck driver passing through the area, taking odd routes to make a living. He disguised himself and rented a small apartment on the edge of town. During the day, Nick observed the locals, casually chatting at diners or gas stations. Everyone was polite, almost overly friendly, as if trying to erase any doubt. But unease settled in at night as the highway stretched endlessly into darkness, lit only by the occasional flicker of headlights. It was Nick's third night on the highway. Suddenly, a figure darted across the road, briefly illuminated by the truck's headlights. He slammed the brakes, the truck skidding slightly before coming to a halt. His mind raced. Who would be out here at this hour? He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, scanning the roadside. As the flashlight swept across the ground, Nick spotted something wedged under a nearby rock, a crumpled piece of paper. He hesitated, then stepped forward and bent down to pick it up. The paper read, "Turn back. You won't find them alive." A chill ran down his spine. He swept the flashlight across the area again, but saw no one. Nick hurried back to his truck. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, but all he saw was the dark highway stretching behind him. The note felt like a warning, and Nick knew he couldn't ignore it. The following night, Nick parked his truck at a small rest stop along the highway to get a better vantage point. Around 2 a.m., he noticed a car with its lights off creeping along the road, as if trying to avoid detection. Nick started his truck and followed from a distance. The car turned onto a dense, overgrown path leading away from the highway. Nick parked nearby, grabbed his binoculars, and observed. A masked man stepped out of the car, dragging a heavy-looking bag. He disappeared into the trees. Nick's instincts kicked in, and he quietly followed on foot, keeping his distance. After a few minutes, he spotted the man crouched by a small fire, rummaging through the bag's contents, wallets, phones, and jewelry. Nick crept closer, careful not to make a sound. His plan was to observe long enough to identify the man and his habits, then report back. But as he moved, a twig snapped under his foot. The masked man said,
"Who's there?"
Nick raised his hands in surrender.
"Just a truck driver passing through. Got lost."
The masked man stood up, holding a knife.
"This road isn't for wandering. You should leave,"
he muttered before vanishing into the woods. Nick immediately called for backup, and a quick search of the area uncovered a stash of stolen goods. 2 days later, the masked man was caught and identified as a petty thief who had been robbing and extorting travelers. Nick's instincts told him this man wasn't responsible for the disappearances. The thief's petty crimes were nothing compared to the horrors the missing travelers had faced. After capturing the masked thief on the highway, Nick couldn't shake the unease in his mind. The petty thief's words echoed in his memory. The real monster isn't dumb enough to get caught. He started noticing inconsistencies. A house with windows perpetually shut. A place he often passed but never saw anyone. Upon investigation, he realized it was his cousin Derek's house, who lived on the town's outskirts. Derek had always been approachable, someone Nick trusted. But during a casual visit to Derek's house, Nick sensed something was off. Derek's home was cozy, adorned with old family photos, and faintly smelled of wood. While chatting over coffee, Nick's sharp detective instincts picked up on strange details. Scratches on the floor near a cabinet, an unusual lock on the basement door, and a faint metallic scent in the air. While Derek excused himself to take a call, Nick wandered through the living room, his curiosity growing. A framed photo on the mantel caught his attention. It was a picture of Derek standing with a group of locals, including a man reported missing months ago. That night, Nick pretended to leave but parked his truck nearby, watching. Using his lock-picking skills, Nick snuck around the back and gently opened the door. Nick opened the basement door and descended the stairs. The stench hit him first, a nauseating mix of damp earth and decay. The dim light from a single bulb revealed a chilling scene. Rows of Polaroids were pinned to the walls, some showing missing persons from case files, all in varying states of fear and distress. A bloodied tarp covered something large on the floor. Nearby were necklaces, wallets, and torn jackets scattered carelessly. The basement resembled something out of a nightmare. Rows of industrial freezers lined the walls, each labeled with dates and names. A workbench was filled with surgical tools, knives meticulously arranged. As Nick turned to leave, he heard footsteps above. Derek's voice rang out, calm but chilling.
You weren't supposed to see this, Nick.
Derek appeared at the top of the stairs, holding a shotgun, his face devoid of its usual warmth. He revealed his twisted reasoning, claiming he was protecting the town by ensuring no locals came to harm. Knowing he couldn't reach his concealed weapon, Nick noticed a toolbox on a nearby shelf. Inside, he spotted a flashlight with a cracked lens and a reflective object sticking out of the corner, an old mirror. He began forming a plan. Nick stepped back toward the toolbox, feigning nervous compliance.
At least let me clean up the mess I've made, Derek. Let me pull the tarp back.
As Nick knelt to adjust the tarp, he discreetly grabbed the mirror from the toolbox. Using the flashlight's cracked lens to create a distraction, he angled the mirror to reflect the light from the overhead bulb. Nick raised the flashlight, aiming it at Derek. The cracked lens split the beam, momentarily blinding and distracting him with the sudden burst of light. As Derek instinctively stepped back, Nick lunged toward a nearby shelf, knocking over a stack of paint cans. The heavy cans tumbled down, causing Derek to stagger and drop the shotgun. Nick slammed the basement door shut and locked it from the outside, using a nearby chair to block the handle. Wasting no time, he pulled out his phone and called for backup. Authorities arrested Derek and seized the horrifying evidence from the basement. Inside the freezers were packages labeled as meat, but peeling back the layers revealed severed hands and feet, meticulously wrapped and disturbingly labeled. Even as the case was closed, Nick couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness of Silver Hollow ran deeper than his cousin's monstrous deeds. The neighbor's dark secret. I often have insomnia, so I often choose to stand at the balcony door, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. I live in a really isolated neighborhood. The houses around here are not right next to each other, although I do have a neighbor who has a fence that I can see over if I stand on the balcony. I'm not being nosy or anything, but that night, I was looking into his yard. I've never met him because that neighbor just moved in, but I assume he lives alone because there's only one black truck parked in his yard. Today, I continued to go to the balcony and look at his yard. The truck had been missing for a week. I played the game of observing the truck at night and theorizing about its purpose, even though that was none of my business. Suddenly, one day, I saw him. My neighbor walked out of the house, dragging something. It looks like it's a long, black bag. It looked quite heavy, and it took him a lot of strength to pull it. On the ground, there is a leak of something that looks thick. He struggled to lift it, then pulled it toward the truck, sliding the side door open. He stuffed the bag into the trunk before driving away, then glanced around as if checking to make sure no one was watching. I stood there, my mind spinning. I couldn't ignore it anymore. So I called the police. They arrived quickly and checked around his property. I stayed, watching from the window as they spoke to him, but then his demeanor was completely different. He led the police to one of his bags, opened it, and inside was meat. He started pointing at his dog, which barked eagerly as he lifted it, filled with excitement. The screams, he claimed, were just him rehearsing a scene from his favorite TV show, and he did it every night. The police found nothing else. To protect my identity, the police came inside and spoke privately about me calling them. They warned me. They said if I continued calling without evidence, I could be charged with privacy violation and harassment. When they left, my neighbor came over, placing a hand on my shoulder. With a friendly smile, he said, "Let's not let little misunderstandings get out of hand, all right?" It felt like a warning. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he really was just an odd guy, with strange habits. Every night, I hear faint, muffled, haunting screams. I tell myself it's just him rehearsing, as he said. Then one evening, he showed up at my door holding a cake. He told me it was his birthday and gave me the cake to clear up any unnecessary misunderstandings between us. Was he smiling? I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks, but I felt like he was giving a sinister smile behind my back, waiting for something. As I closed the door, a wave of fear came over me. I took the cake into the kitchen. I placed the cake on the table, not daring to eat it, and just stared at it for a while. I considered eating it, dismissing my paranoia, and slowly brought it to my mouth. But then, something like an instinct told me not to. I put it down, reminding myself to stay alert. Thinking of him preparing it, watching me, knowing I'd eat it. It was truly horrifying. I grabbed the cake, took it to the trash bin behind the house, and threw it away. I didn't care if I was being unreasonable. I'd rather be safe than sorry. Early the next morning, when I went out to take out the trash behind the house, something caught my eye. There, beside the trash bin, was a small mouse, dead. Its tiny body lay still, right next to where I had thrown the cake the night before. A thin trail of cake crumbs led from the cake to the mouse. The mouse had eaten the cake and died. His depravity was beyond imagining. The cake was not a gift, it was a warning. From that moment, I started watching. Every sound, every strange occurrence, every word from my neighbor. Now I knew he wasn't just a harmless eccentric. He was hiding something dark. Everything started again when I walked past my neighbor's house. My steps slowed as I glanced at his front door, catching sight of a hand pressed against the glass, moving frantically. The glass was old and foggy. I saw someone inside, exhaling and writing help on the dust-covered window. For a second, I turned away, rushing back home. I didn't want to know what was happening behind that door. Back in bed, I couldn't sleep. The image of that pleading face, the desperate scrawl on the window, kept replaying in my mind. The sounds, the black bag, the screams. If I reported this to the police, I knew he'd find a way to cover it up, like he always did. Without evidence, everything would be pointless. I needed a clear and specific plan. I decided to reach out to my friend. I met my friend at the local cafe and explained everything, detailing the strange events and horrific scenes. He looked at me, skeptical, but didn't dismiss it right away. We had known each other for so long, neither of us wanted to believe this was happening. Then he suggested gathering photo and video evidence using advanced technology to avoid detection. I had to do whatever it took to prove my words. Neither of us could imagine what we were about to do next. But I promised him that we would only collect evidence and leave quickly and discreetly. The next morning, I put on a plumber's uniform and a fake mustache, mentally preparing for my decision. I approached my neighbor's door, disguised as a plumber. He opened it, eyeing me strangely, scrutinizing. He glanced at my house, then back at me, asking, "Nick, is that you?" I froze for a moment. I began faking my voice, using a different tone to deceive him, explaining I was sent to check and fix the city's main water pipes. At first, he seemed suspicious and told me to wait a moment before closing the door. I stood outside, not knowing what he was doing inside, waiting and adjusting my glasses. But eventually, he acted friendly and allowed me inside. As I entered, the house was much tidier than I had expected, and nothing suggested he was a murderer. As I pretended to inspect the pipes under his kitchen sink, he stayed close, following me throughout the house. My every move was under his watch. I hadn't anticipated this. His presence was a constant reminder that one wrong move could be my last. I racked my brain for a way to separate myself from him. Then, an idea struck. I asked him to let me check the pipes in the basement, explaining that I needed to inspect the pipes there, adding, "If you come with me, you'll need to be careful. A broken pipe could be very dangerous and make things worse." He hesitated, but finally, he allowed me to go down to the basement alone. I watched his shadow disappear into the darkness. I turned my attention to the house, moving quietly, looking through every corner, hoping to find something out of place. And then I saw it, an edge jutting out along a wall, as if something was being hidden. My fingers brushed along the edge, feeling the rough texture beneath my hand. With a gentle push, the panel creaked open, releasing a foul stench that made me nauseous. I hesitated. Well, would I pro? The smell was nearly unbearable, but curiosity overpowered my fear. I cautiously stepped closer, peering inside. There, in the dim light, I saw a long streak on the floor leading to black bundles that were oozing blood. Then I saw dozens of bodies, skeletal remains intertwined with decomposing corpses. Just as I was about to turn and escape, a cold hand gripped my shoulder. "Hello, my neighbor," a familiar voice whispered in my ear, full of malice. I felt the pressure of his grip tightening, but before I could react, he shoved me forward, standing in front of the door, blocking my only exit. His eyes showed satisfaction. I reached for my phone and pressed the emergency alarm button, just as my friend and I had planned beforehand. He quickly snatched the phone from my hand. Then there was a crackling sound as he crushed it underfoot. I realized I was truly trapped. The police stormed into the house unexpectedly. My friend, true to his word, had taken action when he received my emergency signal. He had told me beforehand that he would alert a trusted officer in case anything happened. The neighbor began to flee, but during the pursuit, he couldn't escape our plan. He was caught and couldn't deny the overwhelming evidence. When I handed over all the footage and he was taken into custody, I lay in the hospital thinking about what I'd been through. I had come closer to death than I ever imagined. I regretted nothing. Night shift nightmare. Jen was sitting at the dimly lit reception desk, trying to stay awake. She was checking the computer, reviewing her work, when suddenly, she felt someone lightly tap her on the shoulder. Startled, she turned around but found no one there. Worried, she chuckled, dismissing it as fatigue in her imagination. But a few minutes later, she felt a light but distinct tug at her hair. She froze, her hand slowly moving to the back of her head. The vague sensation of fingers lingered, as if someone was right behind her, almost unseen. She suddenly turned around again, but there was nothing. Then a book on the far end of the desk fell to the ground with a loud thud. As she shifted in her chair, Jen jumped. She focused on the book on the floor, the silence enveloping her. She shook her head to clear it and tried to brush it aside. She walked to the break room to collect herself. As she poured coffee into her cup, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, as if eyes were staring at her from the dark corner of the room. At 3:30 a.m., Jen returned to the lobby, sitting back at her desk, clutching her coffee cup. She checked the security cameras on her computer screen. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. She jumped up, quickly glancing outside through the glass, but only her own reflection stared back. Her hand lingered on the doorknob, uncertain. After a tense few seconds, she unlocked it, cracked it open, and peered outside. The night air was cold and empty. Jen closed the door and returned to her desk. Trying to shake off her fear, Jenna grabbed some cleaning supplies and headed toward the pool area as requested by her manager. Her footsteps echoed as she approached the edge of the pool. Just then, she noticed a faint outline of wet footprints, as if someone had recently walked through. She fearfully brushed past it, ignoring it as if she had never seen it, and continued with her work. She bent down to pick up a few scattered leaves, floating on the surface of the water. At that moment, she felt it, a strange sensation as if a dark shadow was lurking just beneath the surface of the pool. She hurriedly tried to leave, but before she could react, something yanked hard at her ankle, pulling her down into the pool. Jen lost her balance and fell into the cold water, her body soaked. Panicked, she felt as if she were drowning. She began to flail, sputtering water, then staggered out of the pool, trembling and looking around in confusion, not understanding what was happening. Jen struggled against an invisible force, her hands clawing at the pool's edge, but she was held tightly by a weight she couldn't comprehend. Her vision began to fade when she suddenly saw a woman raising a skeletal hand, pointing directly at her, saying something like, "I hate you all," before vanishing. Just as she was about to lose consciousness, Jen summoned her last bit of strength to escape, gasping for air as she surfaced. Hair disheveled and soaked, Jen stammered as she recounted what had happened by the pool to her manager. She tried to explain how real that feeling had been, but her manager merely checked the cameras and remained skeptical. He insisted that perhaps she just slipped. To her, it was different. She knew it was more than just a slip. Back at the reception desk, Jenna sat there exhausted. She felt foolish and paranoid, wondering if her fear was just in her head, fueled by her coworkers' ghost stories. Her gaze scanned the security cameras, but she hesitated, afraid of what she might see. She quickly packed her things, not wanting to spend another minute in the building. Her shift was about to end. Jen walked out suddenly. The doorbell rang softly in the empty lobby. Her eyes glanced toward the hotel. She held her breath as she watched the front door slowly open, revealing darkness inside as if someone was standing there. But she thought it was enough and turned around to leave immediately. As she drove home, Jen realized she would have to return to work the next day. The haunting spirit would be waiting, and the cycle of fear might never end. She needed to confirm this truth. Night shift nightmare. The next day, Jen stood behind the dimly lit reception desk, her hands slightly trembling as she stared at the empty lobby. The memory of the ghostly encounter lingered in her mind, but she pushed it aside. reminding herself that she needed this job. Jen reluctantly walked towards the pool area. The flickering lights cast strange shadows, making the room feel even more frightening. She glanced at the water, fearing the woman would reappear. But the pool remained still, the surface undisturbed. Jen took a deep breath, regaining her composure for the cleaning task ahead. As she began cleaning the pool, Jen's eyes scanned the area. She didn't see the ghost. Instead, her gaze fell upon a room she had almost never noticed before, peeking out from behind a dusty curtain. She stepped inside, her eyes landing on a pile of old papers stored in the corner. Curiosity sparked. She approached and began sifting through the dust-covered documents. Among them, an old article caught her eye. The headline read, "Mysterious Murder at the Hotel. Night Staff Member Missing." The article recounted an incident nearly a year prior, where a woman was brutally murdered by one of the hotel's night staff during a blackout. The next morning, the disfigured body of the woman was found with a flower pinned to her dress, but there was no sign of the staff member responsible for the crime. Jenna's mind raced as she processed this information, piecing together the fragments of a tragic story. Determined to shake off her fear, Jen continued her work. But as she bent down to pick up leaves, she felt someone behind her. She hesitated, fear enveloping her. Standing upright, she glanced around the empty pool area, but saw nothing. Jen continued to finish her cleaning, but once again, she caught sight of a dark shadow on the water. She turned around, but it was too late. The ghost was right behind her. An eerie smile stretched across her distorted face. Jen staggered back, the ghost's laughter echoing in her ears as she was drawn into the pool. The world around her felt like an endless abyss. Jen panicked as she emerged from the water, gasping for air. It stood at the edge of the pool, looking at her with a delighted and smug expression. Soaked and gasping, Jen burst through the door. She headed toward the reception desk, ready to leave the nightmare behind. But as she reached for her bag, she hesitated. She recalled the wronged woman she had seen in the article had also gone missing right there. Could it be her? What if that woman needed her help? The thought lingered, gnawing at her conscience. After much inner turmoil, she decided to return. Upon reaching the pool again, Jen looked around and saw the woman standing at the edge. But then she shouted, "I will help you find him." Jen could see the woman's expression change. She slowly reached out, brushing her icy fingers across Jen's forehead. Images flooded Jen's mind. Flashes of the night of the murder, the struggle, the fear in the woman's eyes. And finally, the face of the night staff, a dim shadow emerging. She returned to the reception desk. Using the hotel's security system, Jen searched for anything unusual, scanning the old footage from that fateful night, but most of it had been nearly erased. However, he missed one scene, him entering through the back door, with small dirt clumps still scattered on the ground. It led to the large abandoned area behind the building. The next day, Jen began searching for hidden evidence. Following the woman's memories, she rummaged through the abandoned land behind the hotel. Jen continued to dig. She discovered broken branches and leftover, but nothing resembling the evidence she sought. She felt like giving up. On the second night, Jen dreamed of the ghost, her distorted face contorted in pain. She was determined to return. After nearly 2 exhausting days, just as despair threatened to consume her, Jen's shovel struck something. She dug deeper, discovering an old box. When she opened it, she found the murder weapon, a knife, and a USB that he had hidden away, intending to destroy it. He seemed to have toyed with the law, disregarding it. Jen hurried to the police station. She presented the evidence she had found. With the evidence in hand, he was identified. After so long, he was finally apprehended. Jen felt the weight lifted off her shoulders. The ghost of the woman appeared behind her, a faint smile on her distorted face. Jen returned, knowing that the woman's soul could finally find peace. She glanced back at the building, but this time she felt it had truly closed. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in dim streetlight. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and an eerie quiet surrounded the building. I was the night shift manager here. Usually things were calm, and nothing happened, just me stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the rest of the world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken by a soft knocking sound. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart behind and walked toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was expressionless, devoid of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and he couldn't stay here. As I turned to leave, a loud bang made me whip around. The man's fists pounded the glass, over and over, each hit louder and angrier than the last. This guy wasn't just some harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, threatening to call the police. Only then did he step back, his eyes still locked on me, full of rage. He slowly walked into the darkness of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to refocus on my work. 15 minutes passed. The knocking, the pounding, the man, all faded from my mind as I got lost in stocking the shelves. But then I heard metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned my cart and ran toward the front, fear swelling in my chest. My heart sank as I saw the glass door slightly ajar. The latch, the only thing keeping the door secure, was gone. Fear engulfed me as I realized what this meant. I needed to get to the office and call the police immediately. I turned to run toward the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was that man. His expression hadn't changed. It was still the same cold, deadly, furious stare. I didn't think. I just ran. I dashed through the door, with the man right behind me. Suddenly, an old, battered van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved recklessly, nearly hitting me as it came to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything turned upside down. A sudden sharp pain erupted in the back of my head. My body stumbled forward as I collapsed onto the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before everything began to blur. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold asphalt. My vision faded, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the truck's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up to a pounding headache, my wrists tied tightly behind my back. The truck jolted and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I had no idea where I was. I began piecing it together. The man. The truck. I had been kidnapped. I knew I needed to act quickly. I glanced around. Inside was pitch dark, but then I saw it. A pile of old tools, a rusty toolbox, and a few scattered pieces of metal on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I heard the guy muttering to himself up front. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the rising panic within me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I edged closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was tricky, but I managed to find a small piece of metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, scraping the metal against the ropes. Every bump in the road threatened to give me away, as the pain nearly made me cry out. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scrapes, and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced at the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake. I noticed the door lock was undone. I needed a plan. The truck slowed as it turned sharply onto a dirt road. The moment I had been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the back door open and leaped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain radiating through my body as I rolled across dirt and gravel. For a moment, I thought I couldn't move, but adrenaline surged within me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the surrounding trees. Behind me, the old van came to a halt. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart racing in my chest. Branches scratched at my skin as I pushed through the thick underbrush. My mind blurred between fear and survival. I could hear the man's voice. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and saw the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could reach it fast enough, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, frantically waving my arms as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed onto the road. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to respond. All I could do was whisper hoarsely, "Help." The driver took out his phone and called the police. In that haze, I could still see his shadowy figure standing at the edge of the forest, as if he were looking at me with eyes full of anger. But he didn't come any closer. Perhaps he knew that everything was over. I was taken to the hospital after everything that had happened. I was told the man had been apprehended not far away. He had been arrested. The police assured me he would be locked up, that he wouldn't hurt anyone again. Even though I was safe, the thought lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? The fear remained, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to make it through that night shift alive. The murderer on Christmas night. Christmas is usually a time of peace and joy, but sometimes it's when the strangest and most terrifying things can happen. The story is about when I was a child. At that time, to be honest, Christmas wasn't my favorite holiday. Sure, the gifts, food, and Santa Claus were great, but somehow, all of that always felt empty to me. While everyone was gathered talking, I went to the dining room to play alone, and that's when everything started. At that time, I thought maybe I had watched too many horror movies, but I swear I saw someone through the window. A shadow passed by the window, just for a second. It was a person, but their face wasn't normal. The man wore a grotesque, demon-like mask. I froze in place. I moved closer to the window to see better, but there was nothing there. I thought maybe it was just my imagination. Then, suddenly, the man lunged forward with the mask, his mouth twisted into a wide, grotesque grin. He gently tapped on the window and pointed at the front door. After that, he moved away from the window and walked toward the front door. A few seconds later, someone began knocking on the door. I ran to warn my dad, but he brushed it off, thinking it was just Uncle Henry bringing in beer. He even joked that I was probably imagining everything because I was bored. My dad hesitated as he stepped toward the door, reluctantly opening it. It was Uncle Henry, which confused me even more. I didn't know what was going on. Despite Uncle Henry's comforting presence, the strange feeling I had didn't go away. I didn't know what to say anymore. I was scared, but my dad seemed to think it was just a prank. My body trembled as I went back upstairs, locked the door, and shoved a chair under the doorknob, trapping myself in my room, trying to escape the growing fear inside me. As night fell, and the family gathered outside to watch the fireworks, I stayed inside, staring out of my bedroom window at the bright lights. Suddenly, someone began knocking on my room door. I was about to open it when I realized something was wrong. I looked back out the window. My mom, dad, grandparents, and uncle were all downstairs. So, who was knocking on the door? I stepped toward the door, my hand trembling as I touched the doorknob. I paused for a second, then looked through the peephole. It wasn't my parents. It was him, the man wearing the demon mask. His voice was deep, but I could still hear it clearly. There was no mistaking it. He insisted that I let him in, promising me horrors if I refused. He even taunted me, threatening to kill me like he had with other children. Terrified, the first refused to open the door, only to hear the door starting to splinter as the masked man tried to break in. I screamed for help, but they outside didn't know the danger lurking inside. In a desperate attempt to cry for help, at the same time, my parents struggled to open the locked back door, which had been mysteriously sealed from the inside. They were panicked, unable to get into the house. As the masked man continued pounding on the door, I watched in horror as the wood began to crack. He was close to getting in, and I could feel my life slipping away. The door shattered, and the man, his face still hidden behind the grotesque demon mask, stepped into the room. He grabbed my neck with terrifying strength. My body writhed, trying to escape his grip. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought this was it. But then, a loud crash sounded from outside the window. He looked up for a moment, distracted. My dad realized the severity of the situation, climbed the ladder to the window, and threw a rock through it. The glass shattered. Without hesitation, my dad climbed through the broken window and rushed into the room just in time to pull him away. He didn't stop there, though. He took a knife and lunged toward my dad. My dad tried to dodge the strike, but the blade grazed his shoulder painfully. Still, he pushed forward. As my dad desperately fought to subdue him, I grabbed a metal lamp from the bedside table and struck him on the head. He staggered back, dazed. Outside, the sound of sirens could finally be heard. We were saved at last. When they caught the man, he referred to himself as the Grinch. They said he was responsible for many child disappearances around my age, and some bodies had been found and buried in his backyard. Since that day, many months later, I still see a therapist because of that man. Every time I sleep, I dream about what would have happened if I hadn't locked my door. I survived, yes, but the nightmares will never leave me. The price of the silent one. I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. I thought it was time to head home. I left the lab late one evening after a long day of experiments. The night was dark, the streets deserted, and the cold air biting at anyone daring to venture out. The road was empty, and the only sound was the distant howl of the wind. As I drove, I suddenly noticed something moving by the roadside. A figure, a girl, walking alone in the desolation. She seemed disoriented, wearing a red coat, her head bowed, and her posture rigid, standing out under the dim light. Something about her felt off, so I slowed my car and came to a stop. I asked her if she was okay. "Do you need a ride?" The girl didn't reply. She kept walking, her steps slow, as if she didn't even notice my presence. Finally, the girl stopped, and she slowly turned around. She had a beautiful face, but her skin was deathly pale, with an expression of anguish as if she had forgotten how to smile forever. She asked for a ride and said she was on her way home. I politely hesitated at first, but then I agreed to give her a ride. I drove along the dark road as the girl sat silently in the back, staring out of the window. As I drove through the town, approaching an old cemetery, the girl's behavior suddenly shifted. She began to grow increasingly agitated. Suddenly, she started clawing at the car window with her nails, screaming hysterically as if she were desperate to escape. She shouted, "Let me out! Let me out!" Panicked and unsure what was happening, I scrambled to unlock the door. She flung the car door open and bolted towards the cemetery. Her speed was unnatural, almost too fast, disappearing into the night. I got out of the car, calling after her, but she was gone, leaving me standing alone in the eerie silence of the darkness. Confused, I drove away, chalking the incident up as nothing more than a strange encounter. A few nights later, I drove home along the same route, but every night, something strange and puzzling happened. I encountered her again, asking for a ride. Each time as we neared the cemetery, she would scream, louder than before, and run into the darkness. It was like a looped tape, ending in terror every single time. My curiosity grew, and I began to wonder if I was witnessing something from another world. After 4 consecutive nights of experiencing the same bizarre encounter, I couldn't ignore her strange, repetitive behavior anymore. I was haunted by thoughts of what might be happening at the cemetery, and the image of her running remained etched in my mind. The next day, I decided to visit the cemetery to investigate. I began noticing the old, weathered gravestones, a strange sensation settling over me as I surveyed the area. After some searching, I stumbled upon a gravestone bearing the name Lydia Ward. What shocked me even more was the image on the grave. It was the girl who had asked for a ride. I was frozen in disbelief. Her date of death was engraved as 7 years ago. A chill ran down my spine as I read the words "killed" in a ritual. My mind began to spiral as the name and face felt eerily familiar. I couldn't shake the memory of another girl named Lydia. She had been killed in a satanic ritual. I realized that I might have been the one who witnessed her death all those years ago. When I was a student, I had taken part in a challenge to prove that demons weren't real and thought I was the only one at the cemetery. But suddenly, I was startled by the sound of a girl screaming. I followed the sound and discovered 3 men torturing a girl. I hid behind a bush to avoid being seen and watched as the men carried out what appeared to be some kind of satanic ritual. When the ritual ended, I thought it was over, or perhaps just a bizarre performance. Then, I saw the men sacrifice the girl, one of them holding a knife, attempting to take her life. I couldn't think of anything. I was terrified and quietly ran away. I acted like a coward, staying silent to avoid getting myself into trouble. My thoughts are now clouded by guilt and confusion. I was one of the last people to see Lydia alive. I feel responsible for not doing more, for not intervening when I saw her that day. I spent the next few days researching Lydia's death. I dug through old police records, spoke to former classmates, and visited the university archives. I discovered that Lydia's death was a tragic and mysterious event. Some students at the school had joined a cult-like group that conducted rituals in the cemetery, and Lydia was their victim. Although the police investigated, no one was convicted. My guilt grew as I realized that I had been there that day but was too afraid to intervene. Perhaps that's why her spirit has come to me. As I dug deeper into everything, I began experiencing strange occurrences. I constantly heard whispers in my home, and at night, Lydia appeared every night, standing at the foot of my bed with her sunken, sorrowful eyes, her mouth whispering softly. My room always felt cold, the air thick and heavy, as if her grief was pressing down on me. I began to wonder if Lydia's spirit was trying to tell me something. Perhaps her murder was tied to a larger conspiracy, and only I could uncover the truth. I returned to the cemetery. I felt her presence guiding me, leading me to a hidden spot behind an old mausoleum. I discovered numerous symbols etched onto the old stone walls and trees surrounding the cemetery. They resembled symbols used in ancient satanic rituals. My hands trembled as I took photos. The cult had used this place. Lydia had died here, sacrificed to summon whatever they worshipped. Piecing together everything I knew, I realized that Lydia's death was only part of a larger ritual that was taking place. The cult had used the lives of innocent people to summon dark forces, and Lydia was the final sacrifice. Overwhelmed by the truth, I knew I couldn't let this mystery remain hidden and unanswered any longer. I finally gathered enough evidence, photos, documents, symbols, to bring to the police and share what I had hidden and discovered. I knew that my actions were the only way to free her soul. The police finally launched a comprehensive investigation into the cult's activities, arresting several former students and members who had participated in the rituals. In the end, justice was served for Lydia, and her soul could finally rest after 7 years of torment. In the final moments, I visited Lydia's grave once more. This time, as I stood before her grave, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. By uncovering the truth, I had redeemed myself, and now I could let go of the guilt that had haunted me for so long. As Rick turned to leave, he glanced back and saw a figure standing in the distance, Lydia's red coat billowing in the wind. He smiled softly, knowing she was no longer trapped, but finally free. The deadly chase. A dark, secluded house appears on a quiet street, hidden by dense trees. In the dimly lit room, Emma and Nick visit the home of a new friend they met recently. His name is Gavi. They sit close, laughing and chatting together. Nick yawns, his eyes drooping, looking unusually tired. Emma notices but brushes it off, thinking he's just weary from drinking a little. Eventually, he mumbles that he needs to lie down. Emma watches him stagger into the living room, nearly stumbling, and starts to feel a bit concerned. But she doesn't notice Gavi's gaze, different from hers. His eyes follow Nick, watching with a look of satisfaction and pleasure. Left alone with Gavi, Emma feels a tense unease she can't put into words. Then he stares at her as he steps closer, his gaze cold and intense. She awkwardly avoids his gaze. Suddenly, he says, "So, let's play hide and seek." Emma feels a bit puzzled, but agrees to ease the awkwardness. Gavi's eyes remain fixed on her, darkening with something unreadable. Emma moves into the dim living room, deciding to play along, hiding under the bed. She tries to stifle a giggle, convincing herself it's just a game. Then, she hears Gavi's voice echo down the hall, his voice husky. "The time limit is 20 minutes. If I find you within that time, you'll be mine." Emma's smile fades, his words linger in her mind, and suddenly, she feels a sense of unease. She continues the game, opening the door to a dark bedroom and slipping inside. Emma crawls under the bed to hide. A sudden crash shatters the silence. The sound of breaking glass echoes down the hallway, and her unease grows with each second. She hears footsteps and objects breaking. Something heavy is being dragged, coming closer. Emma lies still, feeling strangely anxious despite knowing it's just a game. Then she hears his voice from the hallway. "You better hide well, or it won't be fun." As she's about to leave, a hammer suddenly strikes the door. Emma nearly screams in surprise, but she stifles it, covering her mouth with both hands. Then he kicked open the door and entered the room, breathing heavily and holding a massive hammer. Emma started to shiver. Was he just playing? A whirlwind of thoughts disturbed her mind. Then, after a moment, Gavi slowly swung the hammer with all his might at the cabinet. Wood splintered with a loud crack, and the wardrobe door burst open. He muttered to himself as he checked inside, then said, Oh, she's not here too bad. If she had been hit, it would have been quite a show. Emma watched in terror as he moved, each step bringing him closer to her hiding spot. She slowly realized that this was no joke, and he was a madman. Then he lifted the hammer slowly again and circled around. Under the bed, Emma watched him move. A moment later, he stood in front of the bed. With frightening speed, Gavi ripped the mattress off the bed frame, exposing Emma's hiding spot. She froze, staring at him as he raised the hammer, eyes wide with excitement. Then he smashed the hammer into the bed frame, splintering the wood, the hammer landing inches from Emma's head. He yelled, staring through the gap at Emma, saying in sick amusement that he had missed. Emma screamed, crawling out and frantically running out of the room, with him following, dragging the hammer along the wall, his laughter echoing throughout the house. He was close behind her when suddenly the timer went off. He stopped, looked at the clock and said, "Time's up. Let's play another round." Her entire body shaking, she immediately bolted. Emma left his house, jumped into her car, and drove off, calling the police right away. They arrived at his house. When they searched, a sound came from the closet. Cautiously opening it, he lunged out, swinging the hammer wildly at the officers, injuring some severely. At that moment, Gavi was shot dead by the police on the spot, and they discovered horrific things. In his house, they found Nick dead, along with several others who had met the same fate: pale faces, sedative effects, and terrifying injuries. Gavi's guests were forced to play a twisted game, with only a few lucky ones, like Emma, chosen to survive. The unlucky ones were marked, sedated, and ultimately killed in his final sick game, which satisfied his perverse desires. The night at the airport. Kevin was always a hardworking guy, juggling a daytime job and night shifts at the airport to earn extra money. Partly, it was convenient because he lived nearby, making the commute easy. It was Kevin's first night shift. The terminal was eerily quiet when he arrived around 1 a.m. The airport manager handed him a set of keys, saying he would return around 4 a.m.
Do you have a flashlight?
The manager asked. Kevin nodded, assuring him he did, and began his tasks, mopping the floors, inspecting restrooms, and ensuring no pipes were leaking. Everything was so quiet that he could hear the echo of his own footsteps. While wiping down the counters, he glanced out at the silent runway. It was a familiar sight, but tonight, something felt different. Then he heard a woman's laughter from somewhere far away. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the sound was too distinct to ignore.
Is anyone there?
Kevin called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. There was no reply. Suddenly, the sound changed. It was no longer laughter, but heavy footsteps coming from the restroom area. He assumed it might be a homeless person who had snuck in. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the hallway into darkness. He grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the source of the noise. The restroom was at the end of the terminal, and his unease grew with each step. He shone his flashlight into the room, but the only thing he saw was a woman with long black hair, standing with her back to him. He couldn't see her face because she was facing away.
Excuse me, ma'am. You can't be here.
Something was off. She seemed to vanish. He stepped closer, noting strangely that none of the stall doors were closed. Kevin waited a few seconds in the dark with his flashlight before deciding to check for himself. When he reached the last stall, the hair on his neck stood on end. There was no woman. Alone in the restroom, he splashed water on his face, trying to shake off the sleepiness and clear his head. Kevin went out to find the power switch to turn the lights back on, but he froze. On the floor he had just cleaned, there were now dark, blood-like footprints. Sweat began dripping down his forehead as fear took hold. He decided to call his manager, but when he pulled out his phone, there was no signal. The footprints led him to the far end of the airport, near a narrow hallway that descended into the basement. Just before Kevin reached the basement door, he heard something, a heavy, labored breathing. Someone was on the other side. From the darkness, he saw an eye, wide open, with a tiny black pupil staring at him through a crack. Kevin panicked, collapsing to the floor. He had never felt this kind of fear in his life. Suddenly, the eye blinked, and Kevin realized he was entirely alone in the airport. He remembered locking the doors after the manager left, meaning there was no way anyone else could have entered. So, who was on the other side of the door? Suddenly, a bony hand with skeletal fingers appeared through the crack and beckoned to Kevin. The terrifying eyeballs stared at him. The woman's laughter echoed once more, and then the basement door burst open. Kevin wanted nothing more than to stand and run as a spine-chilling scream erupted, shattering every glass window around him. Kevin shielded his face from the flying shards and began shouting for help. Then, a chilling gust of wind swept over him. He opened his eyes to see a terrifying woman staring directly at him, so close that Kevin could feel her icy breath on his skin. Her face was gaunt, with blood dripping from her head as she stared into him. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but only distorted moans escaped. Then everything faded to black. Later, he awoke to someone calling his name. Kevin found himself lying on the floor, with the manager helping him up. Looking around, everything seemed untouched. There were no footprints or broken doors. After leaving, Kevin learned he had passed out near the site where a woman had been assaulted by a dangerous man. The culprit had disguised himself as a janitor to hide in the airport. Perhaps Kevin's decision not to follow the ghost into the basement had saved his life. The mysterious curse of donuts. Moving into a new house is always unsettling. John and his wife, Lisa, had just moved into an old house next to an abandoned Dunkin' Donuts, left in ruins nearly a decade ago. They had no idea the house harbored such a dark history. The fire had destroyed the building, leaving behind charred ruins and rumors of hauntings, which gave the area an eerie reputation. However, they never believed in such tales. At first, they enjoyed their new home and gradually adjusted to the quiet neighborhood. However, things quickly turned strange when a mysterious box of donuts began appearing on their doorstep every morning. It was a plain cardboard box, unmarked and without any notes, containing a dozen perfectly arranged donuts. John was suspicious, thinking it was some kind of prank, but Lisa, on the other hand, was delighted. She loved sweets, especially donuts. He brought the box inside, and Lisa eagerly opened it.
Look, they're fresh.
She exclaimed. He frowned.
I don't know. This seems a little strange.
John felt uneasy trusting food from strangers. Despite Lisa's claims that he was overreacting, John threw the donuts away. He didn't want to take any risks, but the next morning, it was back. Another box of donuts. He threw it away again, but the pattern continued. A few days later, a new neighbor moved in and brought them a box of donuts as a gift. John's instincts told him something was off, given the recent events. He gave a weak smile, took it inside, and threw it away. But one day when John came home, he found her eating a donut from the box. She dismissed his concerns with a weak laugh, saying,
It's just a donut.
That night, however, things took a disturbing turn. John woke to the sound of 3 knocks on the window, followed by 2 more. Then it intensified as he heard footsteps in the hallway and a strange bell ringing. It was a soft chime, like a hotel bell ringing. When John asked Lisa if she heard it, she mumbled in her sleep, turning her back to him. Over the next few days, the noises became more frequent. The knocks, footsteps, and bells. They felt like they were living in a nightmare. Lisa began acting strangely, growing distant and staring at the wall. One night, John found her standing completely still in the kitchen.
Lisa, what are you doing?
He asked. but she didn't reply. Suddenly, the same bell rang, and before he could react, she turned to him with a vacant stare and lunged at him with a knife in her hand. John narrowly dodged the knife, staggering backward. He escaped death by a hair's breadth, but Lisa's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Then she charged at him, as though possessed by madness. She began chasing John through the house, as if something was controlling her every move. However, as John reached the front door and flung it open, Lisa suddenly stopped. Her head jerked to one side, her neck twisting unnaturally as she stared at the abandoned Dunkin' Donuts building.
Lisa?
John called out, desperate.
What's happening to you?
But she didn't reply. She just began walking toward the ruins, her steps slow and deliberate. John followed her, keeping a safe distance. The neighbors began stepping out of their homes, drawn by the commotion. An elderly man approached John, his face pale and filled with confusion. He warned John that the building had a dark history. It had burned down 10 years ago, killing 6 people inside. He said, rumors claimed the place was cursed, though no one knew the full story. John looked at Lisa, who continued walking toward the burned ruins, oblivious to everything around her. The entrance was nothing but rubble and charred remains. She stepped inside and headed straight for the old counter. Fearful, John followed her, unable to leave her alone. Lisa bent down and picked something up from the debris. It was a tarnished desk bell, identical to the one John had heard in their house. Lisa placed it on an old countertop and began ringing it repeatedly, as if entranced. The sound echoed through the ruined building, sending a chilling wave through him. Not knowing what else to do, he shakily called the police. When the police arrived, Lisa was still standing there, her face void of expression, ringing the bell like a madwoman. They sedated her and took her away. They admitted her to a mental health facility, but she hasn't responded since. 2 years have passed, and Lisa still hasn't opened her eyes. John can't shake the feeling that the donuts somehow caused all of this. He wishes she had never eaten those donuts that The nightmare trip on Christmas Day. In December, my girlfriend Charlotte and I were driving to the Poco Mountains. We had rented a small wooden cabin that looked super cozy, decorated with Christmas ornaments, and had a beautiful view. That night, there was a snowstorm forecast, so we left a bit earlier to have time to buy groceries. After that, we headed straight to the cabin. The house was surrounded by forest, and we had to make several trips from the car to bring everything inside. I did the usual things, like checking the fridge, turning on the TV to see if there was cable or Netflix, and looking out all the windows to make sure everything was fine. Then there was a basement for recreation. I went down to check it out. It was quite large compared to the size of the house. It felt detached from the cabin, dark, and rather chilly. Then there was a knock on the front door. I hurried upstairs to answer it. I was surprised and confused to see a guy who looked like he was in his late 40s. He wore gray sweatpants and a tattered tan jacket. He smiled at me and asked,
"How's everyone doing?"
I started asking if he was the owner. He introduced himself as Tom and said he ran the place with his brother. Tom said he lived just up the road if my girlfriend and I needed anything. At that moment, I found it a bit odd that he knew I was with my girlfriend. He left quickly. We continued watching a Christmas movie and enjoying the quiet, but an uneasy feeling started to creep in. When I went to shower, I was startled as the water suddenly turned ice cold. I quickly got out and texted Mike, the cabin owner, asking if there was an issue with the water heater. Mike replied a while later, saying he'd send someone to check it the next day. Around midnight, we woke up to loud banging on the front door. Charlotte shook me awake, terrified. I said I'd check to see who it was, but she was terrified, begging me to stay in the room and keep quiet. The knocking continued, growing louder and more persistent, before suddenly stopping. We sat upright in silence for a few minutes, whispering to each other. I went to lock the bedroom door to feel safer. After a while of staying alert, we eventually fell asleep. The next morning, there was a lot of snow outside, and it was a cloudy, gloomy day. I stepped out to clear the snow off my car. While doing so, I noticed fresh footprints in the snow. They circled around the house. I heard footsteps approaching, and I saw Tom suddenly appear. He said,
Is everything okay?
I started telling him about what we had experienced the previous day. He even laughed at me, saying I was being paranoid, and assured me he would help check the water heater, which we had complained about earlier. Tom offered to check the water heater. Reluctantly, I agreed to follow him to the basement. At that moment, I texted Mike that Tom was here and helping me check the water heater, but Mike hadn't replied yet. Once in the basement, Tom said he needed to grab some tools from the house next door. But then, he slammed the door shut, startling me, and I had no idea what was happening. Then I heard the click of a lock, indicating the door had been locked. Before I could react, my phone buzzed with a message from Mike. He texted, "Is Tom the plumber's name?" I replied, "No, he said he's your brother." Mike then replied, "No, who is this person?" Frozen with fear, I sent a voice message. "Help me. He's here, I'm trapped, and my girlfriend is in danger." Just then, Charlotte's scream rang out. I panicked, banging on the door. A moment later, the door finally opened. In a panic, I ran upstairs and saw Tom restraining Charlotte, covering her mouth. She saw me, and while he was distracted, hit his hand. In pain, he pushed her away. At that moment, I felt a surge of strength to protect my girlfriend. I charged at him and punched him in the face, causing him to collapse temporarily. During that moment, we managed to escape the house with great difficulty, running through the snow to reach our car and driving away immediately. When I called Mike for help, he immediately contacted the police. Mike apologized for the unfortunate events and called to report the man named Tom, who had impersonated his brother. The story behind Tom's behavior involved a psychological trauma from his past. His partner had abandoned him for an extended period. He began impersonating the homeowner's brother to easily infiltrate couples' lives, creating a sense of familiarity, then stalking and observing them when they weren't paying attention, ultimately plotting to harm and separate them. Charlotte and I finally understood the reason behind Tom's behavior, and although we escaped the danger, we could never forget the terrifying hours we endured. The Deadly Neighbor. My family and I moved into a house in the suburbs, and the neighbors seemed friendly until I met Mara. She happened to be the neighbor next door, and my mom quickly befriended her. At first, she seemed kind and friendly, often visiting my mom for coffee chats, but there was something unsettling about her. One afternoon, Mara visited us. She and my mom were chatting on the balcony, and I don't know why I was there. Probably out of boredom, but I sat with them. Before my mom stood up to get a cake she had just baked, I was still sitting at the table with Mara, and that's when my life might have changed forever. Mara was a ghostly-looking woman, thin with long black hair and unnaturally large yellow eyes. Her eyes were so unnatural that maintaining eye contact for more than 3 seconds felt impossible. We sat in silence until she suddenly turned toward me, a creepy smile spreading across her face. She began tilting her head slowly from side to side, almost like a puppet, and then said, "Are you ready to go now, little one?" I froze in place. Her voice had changed significantly. There was something darker about it. She began pulling out a black rose from her purse, an odd-looking flower, and held it out toward me. It was the first time I'd ever seen a black rose, and I started sweating from fear. Before I could react, My mom returned with the tray of cake, and Mara suddenly reverted to normal, as if someone flipped a switch. She quietly placed the black rose back into her purse, her face expressionless, and my mom didn't notice. I left the balcony, trying to dismiss the encounter, but something inside me knew that she was no ordinary neighbor. At night, my room was on the ground floor, and my window was high up. To be honest, I was never an easily frightened kid, but that night, I didn't know why, a strange feeling flooded my mind. I kept tossing and turning, nervously checking and peeking out the window every 5 minutes. Finally, as I began to drift off, I decided to look out the window one last time to ease my mind. But to my horror, Mara was standing at my window, the faint moonlight illuminating her smudged, grinning lips, just like the eerie smile I had seen on her face earlier that afternoon. I began walking toward the door with trembling legs, sweat pouring down like rain. As I kept moving, Mara's sinister yellow eyes followed me in slow, puppet-like motions. I reached for the doorknob, but then she raised the black rose again and muttered those eerie words. "I hope you're ready now." I screamed, "Please leave me alone." The moment I said that, her smile disappeared, replaced by an angry scowl as she shook her head side to side in disapproval. Then the worst happened. Mara was trying to get inside. She gripped the window frame and began slamming herself against it with both hands. Horrified, I watched as the window slid open, and she began pushing her head through the gap. Mara's body twisted unnaturally, like a puppet manipulated by invisible strings. Panicking, I grabbed the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. It was stuck. I couldn't open the door. She was almost inside. I heard her laughter, a sound that sent terror coursing through my veins. "You will come with me. You will be my last one." Suddenly, the door opened, and I bolted out of the room, screaming for my dad. He was a light sleeper, and when I burst into his room, he jumped out of bed in a panic. All I could say was, "Mara, the window." You know how people vanish when someone else comes? The same happened to me. I caught a glimpse of Mara leaving. I saw her in the distance, disappearing into the shadows beyond a house as the faint glow of lights passed over her. But my dad didn't see her. He checked the window, but Mara was gone. The next morning, I woke up to see police cars parked outside Mara's house. They were murmuring that the police had found something horrific inside her home. I was grateful to be alive. They had found innocent lives, 4 children's bodies buried in her backyard. With each body, she had buried a black rose, as if part of some dark ritual. And I might have been the last one. To this day, I wake up at night drenched in sweat, terrified that Mara is standing near my bed, tilting her head to the left with that same malicious smile, whispering, "You will come with me." The haunting of invisible ghosts. His name was Henry, and he always enjoyed taking late-night walks. There was something about the stillness that made everything feel simpler. It had been this way for years, a nightly routine for him and his dog, Boss. Henry had been a welder for over 40 years. Now, he was living alone on this large farm. The house, too big for just one person, had felt empty ever since Maria, his wife, passed away. Henry's children had moved out long ago, and after cancer took his wife's life, it was just Henry, left alone with the memories. Tonight, after a long day, Henry decided to take a walk. The cool night air was refreshing, and his dog Boss trotted beside him, his nose sniffing the ground as if searching for something. As Henry made the loop around the house, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement in the second-story window. The bedroom window, the one that belonged to Maria. Henry stopped. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow, something or someone moving inside. Henry's heart raced, not believing his eyes. He hadn't set foot in that room for years, let alone let anyone else in. Henry stared up at the window, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him, but something wasn't right. Without hesitation, he rushed inside, Boss close behind, and stormed up the stairs 2 at a time. When Henry reached the bedroom, the door creaked open slowly. The room was empty, exactly as he had left it. Henry's eyes scanned the space, nothing out of place, no signs of anyone being there. Henry felt foolish for overreacting, but that unease, that creeping sensation, stayed with him. Something had been there, Henry was sure of it. The next night, Boss's low growl woke Henry from a deep sleep. He sat up, listening, straining to hear over the pounding in his ears. That's when he heard the creaking of floorboards. Henry's first instinct was to grab his rifle, and he moved into the hallway, raising the gun. A dark figure stood at the end of the hall. A woman, her face obscured by shadows, her hand stretched toward him, fingers unnaturally long. Another night passed. Henry came downstairs early in the morning, only to find the kitchen lights on. He remembered turning them off. Henry grew tense and started calling the police. They searched the entire house, even bringing in the K9 unit, but nothing turned up. Henry could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe him, but he knew something was wrong. That was the last straw. The next night, Henry went back upstairs. He didn't know what compelled him to return, but when he opened the door, the sight nearly stopped his heart. Maria's clothes, which Henry had packed away after she died, were scattered across the floor. It was as if someone had pulled them out. Panic rose in his throat. Henry staggered back, and that's when he saw her. A figure stood in the doorway. A woman, but it wasn't Maria. Henry couldn't make out her face, but she was shorter, thinner, someone he didn't recognize, and her presence filled him with dread. Before he could react, she ran, disappearing down the stairs and into the night. Henry chased her to the front yard, but she was gone by the time he made it outside. Bosley and Henry searched the property, but there was no trace of her. Henry didn't sleep that night. In fact, he hadn't slept in days. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside it all felt like her, lurking, waiting to return. Henry kept his rifle close, afraid he might actually have to use it. A few weeks later, it happened again. Henry was sitting in the living room, trying to distract himself with the television when he saw her. She was standing in the yard, staring at Henry through the window, just a shadow, silhouetted by the moonlight. Henry grabbed his rifle, his hands trembling, and ran outside, firing warning shots into the air. She turned and ran into the darkness, disappearing once again. The shots had probably scared her off for now, but deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The next day, after Henry had been out for errands and returned home late, he didn't see Boss greet him. He searched every corner of the house, but everything felt empty. But Henry still had one last room to check, Maria's room. He stumbled into the bedroom, the door creaking open. Maria's clothes were no longer scattered across the floor. They were neatly hung. But what Henry dreaded had come to pass. The woman was still there, sitting on the bed, staring at him. Her eyes gleamed, and she smiled a cold, twisted smile. She whispered that she had been waiting for him. Henry froze, shocked. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. That voice, it was Maria's. But something was wrong. It was cold, hollow. Before Henry could react, her face shifted from an indistinct blur to something grotesque, her skin melting into a monstrous form. The skin peeled away, revealing rotting flesh underneath. Her eyes sank into her skull, her mouth gaping in a horrifying grimace. Henry screamed and raised his rifle, but it was too late. She lunged at him, and as darkness engulfed him, her fingers seemed to scratch and penetrate his chest. The haunting of invisible ghosts. Henry slowly woke up with a strange feeling, something rough rubbing against his face. It took a moment for Henry to open his eyes and realize it was Boss licking his face. Henry remembered the last time he couldn't find his dog, but after everything that happened, seeing Boss made him feel more at ease. Henry groaned, his whole body aching as he struggled to sit up. Everything felt too stiff, the joints rigid, and the muscles dull with pain, as if she had actually lunged at him, clawing and piercing into his flesh. Boss whimpered softly, his gaze fixed on the bedroom door. Henry glanced over and saw nothing unusual, but he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something strange was inside his own home. Days passed in a vague exhaustion. Every night, it was the same. Boss sat in front of the bedroom door, staring, ears pricked up as if waiting for something. Then, like clockwork, at that exact hour, he would start barking, the sound echoing throughout the house, jolting Henry from his restless sleep. He would get up, gun in hand, and search the house, but he never found anything. The house remained silent, the darkness unchanged. He tried to convince himself that it was just Boss being protective, or perhaps reacting to something normal outside. One night, the barking started again, more intense than ever. He jumped up, hurried down the stairs, gun at the ready, and froze at the sight before him. There, near the living room window, Mari was standing. Her face was gentle, hair flowing in the wind. Henry was paralyzed, an uncontrollable feeling swelling within him. Henry hadn't seen her in years. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of comfort. Boss fell silent, his barking turning into a faint whimper, as if something wasn't quite right ahead. He slowly approached the window, but then something changed. Henry stepped back as Mari's gentle form began to fade, her features distorting, as if cracking horribly, her joints twisting grotesquely, unnaturally. Her eyes seemed to darken, sinking into her face. Her mouth stretched into a wide grin, revealing sharp teeth, with black slime oozing through the cracks in her face. He suddenly realized she had come, perhaps deceiving him and appearing in the form of Mari's spirit. He knew that couldn't be his wife. The figure by the window vanished, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. Henry rushed outside, desperately searching for her, or it, whatever he had just seen. He circled the house, calling for Mari, as if somehow she might still be there, but there was no one. As Henry turned the corner of the barn, he suddenly felt an icy chill. The world around him seemed to shift. The night grew unnaturally dark. It felt like the darkness was swallowing the farm. He heard a whisper, soft and mocking.
Henry.
It was her voice, but distorted and broken, drawing him toward the barn. Henry pushed open the barn door, and there she was again, Mari standing motionless. The whispers grew louder around him.
Come home, Henry. It's time.
The voice echoed from every direction. The darkness closed in, pulling him to his knees as if hypnotized to obey. Her form began to twist again, skin peeling away, revealing a skeletal grin beneath. The barn door slammed shut behind Henry with a piercing noise, swallowing the faint light of the moon. The air filled with voices chanting Henry's name, full of malice. He stumbled back, desperate to escape, but the ground beneath him gave way, sending him plunging into a deep, cold pit. He landed hard on a damp surface. Henry reeled from the overwhelming stench of decay, and as he looked around, rotting corpses, with sunken eyes, stared back at him. He tried to climb out, but the walls of the pit were slick. The bodies began to move, their skeletal hands reaching out, grabbing Henry's legs, pulling him down. A grotesque figure emerged from the darkness above. It was her again, a monstrous version of Mari. Limbs elongated, her smile impossibly wide, filled with jagged, blackened teeth.
Henry, it's time to join us,
she said. Then suddenly, Henry found himself in Mari's old room. The figure leaned closer, its icy breath brushing against his skin.
You can't escape, Henry.
He felt an unnatural pressure tightening around his neck, and he couldn't move. As his vision darkened, it was slowly taking control of him. The first light of dawn crept over the farm. The house lay still and cold, its windows dark and empty. Boss lingered on the porch, his mournful howl echoing across the silent fields. No one knew what really happened. Henry was gone, or perhaps he was still there, but no longer himself. Ghost in the gym. A violent storm raged outside, the rain pattering against the windows of the gym. Today, Nana arrived earlier than usual to prepare for the upcoming exam, hurrying toward the gym. Her gym teacher greeted each student outside the girls' locker room, as usual. Nana entered the locker room, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly due to the storm. She walked to her locker and took out her workout clothes. As she began preparing her things, a faint shadow caught her eye, gliding along the other side of the lockers. She paused, glancing around. Curiosity overcame her, and she called out, "Is anyone there?" Nana walked toward the source of the noise, which was at the end of the locker room, where a row of shower stalls stood, the last stall covered by a thick, dark curtain. Nana approached, the lights beginning to flicker erratically. Not knowing where she found the courage, she reached out and pulled back the closed curtain, revealing only an empty shower stall. She was about to turn away when she sensed someone passing right behind her. She froze for a moment, then a sound like soft sobbing echoed back, sending chills down her spine. The temperature suddenly dropped, a chill enveloping her. At that moment, the voices of other girls echoed in from the hallway. Nana temporarily felt relieved as she stepped out of the shower area and saw a group of students walking by. She asked if they heard someone crying, but the girls exchanged puzzled glances and shook their heads. She returned to the gym class, where everyone was gathered. Suddenly, a terrified scream echoed throughout the gym. A fellow student named Lee ran in, her face pale and filled with fear. She collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The gym class fell silent as everyone stared in horror, confused and frightened. As the teacher pressed Lee to explain, she trembled, describing a horrifying scene she told of a baby, covered in blood, appearing in the bathroom and standing there crying. After class, Nana decided to stay behind for extra practice. She walked alone to the entrance when she suddenly noticed a key lying on the floor and the gym door ajar. A dark sense of unease washed over her as Nana stepped into the dimly lit room. She tried to turn on the lights, but they seemed to be out of order. Determined to push past her fear, Nana decided to prepare for the upcoming swimming exam. She walked to the pool area, the dim lights reflecting off the water. As she approached the pool, she heard a nearby sobbing voice, that of a girl, weak and sorrowful. Nana stopped, looking around the area, but saw no one, and everything fell silent. The overhead lights flickered, distorting her vision for a moment. As she squinted, she saw a shadow floating at the far end of the pool. Her first thought was that it was a student practicing diving, as that occasionally happened. But as time passed, she realized that the shadow wasn't moving. A sense of unease welled up inside her, and she decided to check, just to be sure. Nana approached the edge of the pool, her eyes fixed on the floating shadow. As she got closer, fear surged within her. The water around the shadow began to darken, turning a deep crimson, and she realized with horror that a lifeless body was floating in the pool. Overcome with fear, Nana ran to seek help. Moments later, the police arrived to investigate. They confirmed that the body belonged to a student who had been seen alive just a day before. Nana suddenly realized it was Lee. Her mind was haunted by memories of her friend. She learned that her friend had been haunted by strange visions, driven mad by sounds and sights that no one else could perceive. Lee could not stand the pressure from many sides. It caused her to develop depression and pushed her to the brink. Nana stood at the school gate, watching the flickering lights of police cars fade into the distance. The storm had passed, but a chilling emptiness lingered in the air. She shuddered, haunted by thoughts of the ghostly figure and the cries she had heard. In the following days, Nana lay in bed, tossing and turning as she recalled haunting images. The pale face of her friend Lee, the bloodied child, and the dark water lingered ominously in her mind. In her sleep, the voices of Lee echoed in her ears, pleading, desperate, and faint. With each passing day, they grew louder, resonating in her mind. The next morning, Nana walked through the school hallway, the world around her feeling dreamlike. She paused in front of the gym, staring at the closed doors before walking away. That night, Nana fell asleep. As she closed her eyes, she was pulled into another nightmare. She stood in the gym, surrounded by darkness. Lee's face appeared before her, eyes wide with fear as she reached out, as if wanting to say something. Then everything seemed to change. The water in the pool turned red, and she watched in horror as Lee emerged from beneath the surface, slowly rising as if trapped. Nana tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The next day, Nana's nightmare still haunted her thoughts. Each day was filled with a nagging feeling that she was overlooking something urgent, something dark that only she could confront. She knew she needed to understand what had happened to Lee to help her find peace. Nana dove into research, sifting through old-school records, searching for any information about unexplained incidents at the gym or pool. After hours of digging, she stumbled upon a small article about a tragic incident, the unsolved death of a young girl at the school many years ago. The report detailed how a female student mysteriously drowned in the pool, and witnesses claimed to have seen a crying child nearby, although no child was ever found. Through the faded articles and forgotten records, she discovered that a child had been abandoned at the school. The child had died under tragic circumstances, perhaps explaining why the girl's spirit wandered, trapped here. The more she read, the more Nana understood the connection. The spirit of the abandoned child, full of pain and loneliness, had latched onto isolated students. Lee had been haunted by this spirit, drawn in by her own sorrow. That night, Nana returned to the pool one last time, determined to confront the spirit and free her friend. The water's surface was unusually still, almost holding its breath. A figure slowly emerged from the darkness, the ghostly form of a child, her wet hair hanging in tangled strands around her pale, hollow face. The child's eyes were dark and empty, locking onto Nana with a sharp, calculating gaze, as if probing her intentions. Nana opened her mouth to speak, her voice trembling, but the child moved closer. Suddenly, the child's face twisted, her mouth stretching into a cruel smile. She reached out with her bony, skeletal hand, extending sharp fingers towards Nana like claws. Nana stepped back, fear rising in her stomach, but she held her ground. She could only follow her heart, her voice trembling as she said, "Please, I want to help you." To the child's spirit, the child's smile faded, her expression stiffening, as if she had heard these words before, words that ended in betrayal. The child's empty eyes narrowed, and she lunged forward, her hands clawing at Nana's throat. Nana stumbled back, but she stood her ground, raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I don't want to hurt you. I understand your pain." The child paused, her arms falling to her sides, confusion evident on her face. But then her expression twisted again, suspicion flickering across her features, as if she were battling memories of her own pain and betrayal. In desperation, Nana moved closer, her hand shaking but steady as she extended it. The child hesitated, her appearance wavering between anger and sadness, her expression softening as Nana's words seemed to touch something deep inside. For the first time, the child's expression softened into one of almost peacefulness, her anger dissipating as she released her grip, her form fading into a gentle light. After all, there was one more thing Nana had to do. In her dream, she remembered something that Lee had conveyed to her. Nana recalled being led by Lee to a forgotten corner of the locker room, where an old art portfolio lay hidden beneath a pile of sports equipment, covered in dust. When she was alive, whenever under pressure, Lee would paint vibrant children's paintings, cheerful expressions, and serene landscapes. Each painting was filled with warmth, completely contrasting the darkness that enveloped Lee in her final days. The following weekend, Nana went to the local orphanage, clutching the portfolio to her chest. She handed it to the director of the orphanage, explaining Lee's wishes. As she had promised, Nana had painted and written about their story to memorialize them, ensuring that no one would forget them. Nana returns to school. She reflects on her journey. The remaining echoes of the past have faded, replaced by a feeling of fulfillment. She has somehow helped bring peace to suffering souls. The secret of the black umbrella. Last June, I had just moved to the city to attend college. Heavy rain soaked the campus as I trudged toward the dormitory, my luggage drenched. I walked through the courtyard, and my eyes caught sight of a black umbrella lying on the ground. At that moment, I wanted to find its owner, but I couldn't see anyone around. Reluctantly, I picked it up, thinking I would try to find its owner later. So, I decided to take the umbrella to the dormitory. But when I got to the dorm, I had to rush to change out of my wet clothes and prepare for bed. In the meantime, I hung the umbrella up and almost completely forgot about its existence. Outside, the rain continued to fall. After a long day and soon feeling exhausted, I prepared to sleep. As I lay down, the thought of the umbrella crossed my mind, but I brushed it aside. I woke up at midnight, feeling cold despite being under a thick blanket. A strange chill seemed to seep through the room, and as I lay there, I noticed a shadow in the hallway outside my door. But when I got up to check, I found the hallway empty. This left me a little perplexed. Then, I looked at the black umbrella hanging by the door again and told myself that I would return it in the morning. The next morning, my roommate found me feverish, my skin damp and my body weak. The dorm manager allowed me to stay in bed and rest while my friends went to class. I lay there, dozing off intermittently, the sound of rain pattering against the window only adding to my fatigue. As I slept, I heard footsteps echoing in my room, slow and cautious, as if someone was approaching. My eyes opened wide, but I was too weak to move. I felt a figure hovering beside me, suspended by the bed. Gathering all my strength, I turned my head, and my breath caught in my throat. Standing next to me was a young man, drenched in wet clothes, water dripping onto the floor. I couldn't understand how he got in. I hadn't heard the door open. Then what was peculiar was that in his hand, he held tightly onto the handle of the black umbrella. But the scariest thing was the bloodied, pale, gaunt face, the sunken, distorted eyes of the young man glaring at me with anger. I sat up in fear. He stepped closer, lowering the umbrella and raising his hand, reaching towards me as if to corner me against the wall. I stepped back as the young man leaned closer, his voice hoarse with anger as he demanded the black umbrella back. He made me feel terrified, and I screamed. As he pushed me against the wall, his rage overwhelming. I felt myself slipping away, dizzy with fear. I accidentally hit my head against the wall behind me. The last thing I remembered was his hateful gaze. When I opened my eyes, I saw the dorm manager standing next to my bed, worry etched on her face. She asked if I was okay, saying she heard me scream. I struggled to explain what I had seen, my words tumbling out in a jumble. I was confused about how to answer her. Then she and I looked down at the floor. At that moment, I was startled to see that the black umbrella I had hung at the door was no longer there. Instead, it lay beside my bed as if it had moved on its own. A chill ran down my spine, and I told the manager about the figure I had seen, the young man holding the umbrella. The owner of this umbrella had come here to reclaim it. She didn't say anything after listening, only silently picked up the umbrella. Her demeanor surprised me. It seemed she knew something. She began to tell me the story about that umbrella. Years ago, there was a student living in my dorm, a hard-working young man from a difficult background. He worked multiple jobs to pay for his education, and despite his struggles, he was well liked by everyone. The young man's father, an unusual man with a gambling addiction, tracked him down. After stealing all the money the young man had saved for his tuition, he vanished without a word. Heartbroken and crushed, the young man's spirit became bleak. Until one day, the entire dorm suddenly erupted in chaos after a loud noise rang out from the balcony. Teachers and friends were shocked to discover that he had thrown himself from the balcony. The young man's body lay motionless in a pool of blood, and no one dared to approach to help. The manager said she was there that night. Compassionately, she stood in the rain, holding the umbrella over him until his body was taken away in an ambulance. After the incident, due to the chaos, her umbrella was lost somewhere untraceable and gradually faded into obscurity. A strong gust of wind shook the door, and both of us jumped and looked up. In the doorway, I saw a figure, a young man, soaked and pale, standing just outside. The manager seemed to recognize him immediately. Suppressing her fear, she stepped closer to the apparition, her voice trembling as she spoke soothing words about his pain and loss. Any resentment within the young man seemed to dissipate. After that, everything ended, and I no longer saw that student. My manager continued to oversee my dorm. The black umbrella remained, hanging beside her in the office as a memento of the deceased student. The dark truck. Jack Carson, a rough-mannered, long-haul truck driver known for taking jobs no one else wanted, embarked on a long journey down an infamous, desolate road. His truck was tightly sealed, labeled only as medical supplies. The highway stretched endlessly, eerily quiet, with no signs of life except for the occasional rustling of dead trees in the wind. It was the kind of road you only took if you absolutely had to. Jack stopped at a solitary, dilapidated rest area. He stepped out for a smoke, the silence pressing on him like a physical weight. The wind carried faint, eerie whispers. Jack couldn't tell where they came from, but as he looked around, there was no one in sight. As he leaned against the truck, breathing in the air, a soft yet menacing voice whispered in his ear.
You will die, as I did.
Startled, he turned around, dropping his cigarette, but there was no one there. Just a strange mist swirling outside the window. Shaken, Jack climbed back into the truck and slammed the door shut. He had never experienced anything that felt so real. As soon as he started the engine, the radio turned on with an old, haunting tune. He brushed it off, thinking it was a malfunction. His hands trembled as he turned the knob to silence it, but the static continued, almost as if mocking him. Driving down the dark stretch of road, those words kept echoing in his mind.
You will die, as Yes, I did.
growing louder with each passing moment. Driving deeper into the night, Jack noticed movement on the roadside. He squinted, unsure of what he was seeing, thinking it might be an animal. But as he got closer, the shapes formed into human figures, standing on the roadside, half hidden in the mist. Some waved cheerfully, but upon closer inspection, their smiles were twisted and maniacal, exuding malicious hatred. Others simply stared, their hollow eyes devoid of life. One figure pressed itself against the windshield, grinning mischievously. Jack held his breath as he slammed on the brakes. The figure vanished as soon as he looked away, leaving only the sound of the truck's tires screeching against the pavement. He gasped for breath, panic rising. What the hell is going on? Jack's eyes darted from side to side, trying to make sense of the shapes in the mist. The highway seemed endless. Jack could feel fatigue setting in. His eyelids grew heavy, and the road stretched on endlessly. He eventually stopped at another rest area, hoping to catch some sleep. Jack leaned back in the cabin, closing his eyes and falling into a deep sleep, the hum of the engine lulling him into a false sense of security. Then Jack woke up with a start. A weight pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. His hands were pinned to the seat, leaving him unable to move. A wailing scream tore through the air, very close, as if it came from right in front of Jack. His eyes shot open wide. A figure, a woman, stood before him, her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes milky white and hollow. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. Jack tried to scream, but no sound came out, as if the world was closing in on him. And then everything went dark. He jolted awake, gasping for air. The sun was rising as Jack stepped out of the truck, his body trembling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had tried to take him. The mist had cleared, but the memory of the woman's wailing cry lingered in Jack's mind. Jack returned to the desolate road he had driven 1,000 times before. Tempted by money, he ignored what he had seen before. The thick fog swallowed everything. A figure, barely visible in the mist, darted in front of the truck. Jack swerved, yanking the wheel hard. The truck veered, narrowly missing the faint figure as it lunged toward him. His breath caught in his throat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As the truck wobbled back under control, Jack glanced into the rearview mirror. Nothing, no figure, no movement. Shaking, he took a sip of coffee. The bitter taste did nothing to calm him. It wasn't long before Jack's anxiety turned to sheer terror. Suddenly, an icy chill swept through the cabin, making the hair on his neck stand up. He felt someone sitting beside him. He glanced at the passenger seat. A pale woman with sunken eyes and disheveled black hair, dressed in tattered clothes, sat there in eerie silence. She slowly turned her head to face him, staring intently.
Now it's your turn to pay for the lives you've taken.
Jack gripped the wheel, struggling to keep control of the truck, demanding to know who she was. Then the woman lunged at him, her icy hands tightening around his neck. Jack screamed, but it was choked off. Disoriented, Jack instinctively hit the gas as he struggled to break free from the crushing grip. The truck swerved, its tires screeching on the wet road. Jack's vision blurred, his mind spinning as if he were sinking into darkness. He gripped the wheel with one hand, the other flailing in the air. His fingers passed through her futilely. "Please don't do this." The woman didn't respond, her gaze glowing with a deadly hatred. Jack felt the truck slipping out of control, sliding sideways toward the edge of the road. He tried to hit the brakes, but his legs were numb. Jack's world went black. His body slumped into the seat. The truck careened off the road, the sound of metal scraping against gravel and dirt filling the air until it crashed through the guardrail, plunging into the ravine. The next morning, police investigators arrived at the crash site. The mangled truck lay at the bottom of the ravine, its cargo spilled across the ground. They found Jack's body in the driver's seat, his neck twisted to one side, bruised heavily as if something had crushed it. Investigators and forensic teams began examining the wreckage. Beneath the layers of cargo, they uncovered sealed containers marked with warning labels. Then they uncovered a horrifying truth. Hidden among the legitimate goods were human organs. Jack wasn't just a truck driver. He was a trafficker of human organs, disguised as a legitimate cargo hauler. As the investigation unfolded, it revealed an illicit network that Jack was a part of, operating under protection for years. Many innocent lives had been lost at the hands of these merciless criminals. The ghost of the woman stood at a distance, her purpose fulfilled. For Jack, it was too late. He had no chance to turn back. He had faced the consequences of his actions. Whispers from the mirror. I never thought that agreeing to sleep over at Thomas's house would lead to a nightmare. Thomas was always a bit odd, but as his desk mate, I'd grown used to his quiet nature. He was shy, and our conversations were mostly one-sided, with me doing most of the talking. Thomas was shy and strangely odd, but over time he began to open up. He smiled more often, though there was something unsettling about his smile that I couldn't shake off. One day, out of the blue, Thomas invited me to sleep over at his house. At first, I hesitated, but my curiosity about his mysterious family got the better of me. But as soon as I arrived, something felt off. Thomas's parents greeted me with the same unsettling smile he had, their eyes unnaturally wide. They were overly polite, and their voices held a forced cheerfulness that gave me chills throughout dinner. I could hardly focus on the food because I kept hearing something strange. A faint, distant crying, as if a child was sobbing somewhere in the house. No one else seemed to notice. I tried to ignore it, but the sound was so persistent that I finally had to ask Thomas. He just shrugged, his expression unreadable, and told me not to worry. After his parents went to bed, Thomas turned to me with a big grin and asked,
"Do you want to meet my old friend?"
His tone was cheerful, but something about it made me hesitate. I thought about it for a moment, but I didn't want to seem scared or cowardly. So I nodded, trying to hide my unease. We tiptoed down the dark hallway, the only light coming from the moon outside. I was most surprised by the Donovan family's apparent fascination with mirrors, lining them along the hallway walls. At the end of the hallway, we stopped in front of a large object covered by a cloth. The sobbing sound grew louder, echoing off the walls. Thomas stopped and whispered,
"Don't worry. If he looks at you, just make sure you look away quickly, and you'll be fine."
I didn't understand what he meant, but before I could ask, he pulled off the cloth, revealing an ornate mirror. Its intricate carvings wound around the frame like vines. But the most unsettling part was the sound of the crying. It seemed to come from within the mirror itself. I stared, as if hypnotized, as my reflection faded. Instead, a boy stood there, a boy I didn't recognize. I wanted to believe it was some kind of optical illusion, but then the boy turned and slowly started walking toward me. "Who is that, Thomas?" I asked him, but Thomas didn't answer. He just stood there with a puzzled smile. His face looked stretched and distorted like in a funhouse mirror, his lips curving into a strange smile as he reached out, pressing his hand against the glass. Suddenly, his fingers started pushing through the surface of the mirror, reaching toward me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Thomas yanked me away, shouting at me to look away. He pulled my arm, and I stumbled back, gasping for breath as I moved away from the mirror. His laughter echoed faintly, then faded as he slipped back deep into the mirror. We hurried back to Thomas's room, where he quickly locked the door behind us. Then we climbed into bed. When Thomas finally fell asleep, I lay there, my mind spinning. I had to get out of that house. I quietly slipped out of bed and headed for the door. Footsteps echoed behind me. Panicked, I hid behind the nearest door, peeking through a crack. Mr. Donovan, Thomas's father, walked past, holding a mirror. His voice echoed down the hallway.
He's gone.
Without another thought, I rushed down the hall, desperate to escape. Around me, mirrors reflected different terrified faces, followed by the wailing cries of children. I finally reached the garage, slammed the door shut behind me, and grabbed my bike. I pressed the button to open the garage door. As soon as the door opened, I saw Mr. Donovan standing in the doorway, his face twisted in rage. He lunged toward me, stumbling in his haste, and the mirror he was holding slipped from his hand. It shattered on the floor into pieces. Long, bony arms reached out from the shards, grabbing Mr. Donovan. His screams echoed through the garage as the hands pulled him into the broken glass. Terrified, I jumped on my bike and pedaled as fast as I could, leaving the house and the horrors inside it behind me. I didn't stop until I was far from the Donovan house. When I finally looked back, the house was just a distant silhouette. Late shift and creepy encounter. It is now 9:30 p.m., and I am still here, stuck in the dim light of the computer screen, the only source of light in a dark, empty office. I glance at the clock, sighing in frustration. I have worked here as a software engineer for 2 years, and nights like these have become all too familiar. I hope to leave soon, but I am still waiting for one last file. I push back from my desk, rubbing my tired eyes. The building is silent, too silent. I stand up, deciding to grab a cup of coffee from the cafeteria to stay awake. As I walk through the open office space, I enjoy the quiet, a calm after the daily chaos of the workday. The sound of the coffee maker buzzing is a small comfort as I pour myself a cup. An idea sparks in my mind, and with a mischievous smile, I head to the security room. After working long hours, I have a master key card that opens every door in the building. I swipe the card and step inside, greeted by a wall of screens, each showing a different part of the building. I sit down, curious, and start scrolling through the camera feeds. It's strange to see the empty squares, the vacant hallways making the passage of time more intriguing. Then, something unusual catches my eye. The elevator doors on the ground floor open, and a woman in a green dress steps out. I have never seen her before, and I am sure she doesn't work here. I track them on the camera, watching as they hold hands walking down the hallway. I lean back in my chair, stunned. Mr. Newman, my boss who left early for a celebration, has returned here in the middle of the night with another woman. I switch to other camera feeds, waiting for them to leave, and I return to his office feed feeling something is off about their expressions. I have a bad feeling. The door opens, and the woman rushes out, clearly upset. Mr. Newman follows, trying to reassure her. After a tense exchange, they head towards the cafeteria. I quickly switch to the cafeteria camera, and sure enough, they enter, sitting at a table. Mr. Newman stands up and sneaks into the kitchen area, leaving her alone. I switch to the kitchen feed, and what I see chills my blood. He is holding a knife, his expression tense, eyes searching for something. My mind races, and before I know it, I rush to the cafeteria. I approach the woman from behind, placing a hand over her mouth before she can scream. "I'm here to help," I whisper. "You need to leave. He's going to hurt you." She looks at me, confused yet scared, and nods. We turn to leave, but Mr. Newman appears in the doorway, blocking our exit, knife firmly in hand. He sneers, asking where we think we're going. I step forward, trying to shield her. He laughs, a cruel sound echoing down the hallway mockingly, saying that if so, he'll make sure we both disappear. I feel the woman beside me tense up, his expression shifting as his eyes narrow when he lunges forward, the knife aimed directly at me. I defended, but the impact was still so brutal that the blade stabbed into my hand. The pain seemed to painfully spread throughout my body. I staggered back, gritting my teeth against the intense pain of his madness. He starts shifting his focus to her, cornering her against the wall, and he begins to wildly raise the knife in anger. Desperation drives me, and I grab a nearby chair, swinging it with the last of my strength. The heavy metal frame strikes his head, causing him to stagger back. Blood flows from the cut on his forehead as he crashes to the floor, dazed for a moment. The woman screams, but she quickly pulls out her phone, her hand shaking as she calls the police. I fell against the wall, clutching my arms, my vision blurring as I struggled to stay conscious. He hisses, wiping blood from his face, saying that what I've caused will have consequences because I've ruined all his plans. He tries to stand up, but he staggers, his breathing becoming rapid and angry. The woman steps back, her voice trembling as she speaks into the phone, reporting our location. She stares down at him, a mix of fear and anger on her face. He looks up, eyes wild, and lunges toward her, but I try to grab his ankle, pulling him down. I strain to pull painfully. I shout, my voice hoarse, "Enough! It's over. You won't get away with this." The sound of approaching sirens fills the air, their wails piercing the silence. The police are on their way. Newman's face pales as he realizes time is running out. He kicks my hand in a desperate attempt to escape. The police burst into the building, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They find us in the hallway, and within moments, Newman is handcuffed, his expression one of utter defeat as they lead him away. I was loaded onto a stretcher. The paramedics stabilized my arms while the woman stood next to me, her face a mixture of relief and remorse. The next morning, I sit in a room at the police station, an officer seated across the table, looking at me seriously. He recounts the details they have uncovered. Newman had been seeing the woman at the scene, promising to be with her. But when she found out he was married, she threatened to expose him. Panicked and desperate to protect himself, he planned to eliminate her, believing no one would be there to witness his crime. He brought her to the office, hoping to use the quiet space to his advantage. What he didn't anticipate was my presence, my late-night habits, and my caution leading me to the security room. The officer continues to explain that Newman's wife filed for divorce, her anger and disgust evident when she learned the truth. The woman, unaware of his marital status until that night, expresses deep remorse, shaken that she almost lost her life. I lay on the hospital bed, my hand bandaged. The events of that night replayed in my mind, each moment vivid and unsettling. I stumbled upon a dark secret, and in doing so, I saved a life, narrowly escaping death. I know that night will haunt me for a long time, a reminder of how easily darkness can hide behind familiar faces. But as I prepare to leave the hospital, I feel a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that sometimes, even in the quietest corners of life, we can find ourselves amidst the unimaginable. Sell your soul to the devil. Alex had been acting strangely lately, distant, and his band had temporarily suspended him. His obsession with fame had clouded his mind. He began hearing stories and watching about certain pacts, something involving the other world to achieve his desires, though he laughed it off as if it were a joke someone had made up. Instruments echoed through the empty practice room. Alex had practiced for weeks with frustration, but it was never enough for him. He felt drained and wanted more. Alex always craved fame, attention, admiration. When one of his friends mentioned an old tale about selling one's soul for success, Alex didn't believe it, but his curiosity was piqued, and he wanted to dig deeper. Alex followed directions to the old chapel on campus. It was considered unholy, rumored to be cursed. Following the instructions, Alex arrived at a room in the crumbling building at the end of the hall. Following the instructions, he stood in a circle with ancient symbols and recited the words 3 times. A faint, cold laugh echoed around him, filling the room. His flashlight flickered, then went out, leaving him in darkness. Suddenly, he heard a dragging sound, slow and deliberate, moving toward him from the shadows. From the far end of the hallway, a figure emerged, a woman with long, tangled hair, a pale, lifeless face. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing blood-stained teeth and hollow, dark eye sockets. Alex stumbled backward, falling as she moved closer, each step punctuated by the sickening sound of dripping blood on the floor. As she neared him, she raised a gnarled, bloody hand in front of him, her fingers long and skeletal, ending in sharp claws. Before he could react, she touched his forehead, and a sharp pain shot through his skull. The room around him spun, as if he were falling into a void. Alex was suspended in darkness, drifting with no sense of direction, pulled through a series of horrifying visions. He saw himself on stage, surrounded by a crowd. At first, there was applause, but soon the cheers turned to boos and mockery. Alex's guitar string snapped, cutting into his finger. Blood oozed from his hand as he struggled to keep playing. In another vision, he was alone in a dimly lit room, exhausted and isolated. A mirror reflected Alex's gaunt, aged, haunted face. Dark circles framed his eyes. He looked down at his bruised, scarred hands and tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The visions shifted again, and now he was surrounded by shadows, spirits whispering his name, accusing him, blaming him. Their faces twisted in agony, their fingers reaching out, clawing and dragging him down into the darkness. The images faded, and Alex returned to the hall, lying on the floor. His body ached, as if he had truly endured every wound, every suffering he had just witnessed. He staggered to his feet, the ghostly woman standing just a few centimeters away, her eyes now dark, hollow, and infinite. She leaned in close to Alex, whispering in his mind, promising fame, but at the cost of a life filled with suffering, loneliness, and despair. Drops of blood splattered from her mouth onto the floor, staining Alex's shoes red. He stumbled back, shaking his head, his determination seemingly shattered at the sight. He wasn't brave enough for this. Then she lunged forward in anger. Her claws sank into his chest, piercing through, but with excruciating pain. His scream died in his throat as he was thrown backward, crashing to the floor with an impact that shook him to his bones. Then he was alone again, lying in the empty hallway. Alex staggered to his feet and rushed out. The sky brightened as Alex dashed through the main gate. He clutched his chest, her ghostly claws still imprinted on his skin. Fame turned bitter with fear. He didn't realize she had stolen a part of his soul, leaving his mind to be manipulated by dark thoughts like a puppet on strings. As the days passed and Alex's demeanor grew colder, his voice, once warm and welcoming, now took on a distant, almost haunted tone. People began to avoid him, no longer recognizing the Alex they once knew. A few weeks later, Alex returned to the rehearsal room. As if by a dark instinct, he began seducing other young musicians who, like him, craved fame and admiration. Some people laughed, like he had, but a few were intrigued, curiosity filling their eyes. At midnight, Alex leads a handful of curious people to the cursed old chapel. As they repeat the ritual, one by one, they experience the horrors Alex endured, haunted by images of suffering and despair. Then, Alex turned back alone, his figure fading into the dark hallway, leaving them there. Alex's mind was now a maze of distorted thoughts, controlled and manipulated by a monster. Puppets do dark things. The eccentric neighbor upstairs. I grew up in a small suburban area, living in a quiet apartment on the second floor, right next to the stairs leading up to the third floor. There was one thing that always bothered me, the man who lived upstairs, almost as if he was the only one there. Mr. Huns was a middle-aged man who never spoke to anyone in the building. The kids in the building avoided him. Every morning, Mr. Huns would walk down to the sidewalk in front of his apartment and, with an odd, meticulous habit, water the grass. Only the grass. No flowers, no bushes, just small patches of grass by the sidewalk. His movements were strange, almost robotic. No one ever spoke to him. He was the kind of person everyone avoided. One night, Charlie came over for a sleepover. We watched a basketball game that evening and then went to bed. But Charlie couldn't let it go. He became obsessed with learning more about Mr. Huns.
Does he have a wife? A family?
Charlie sat up, his curiosity reigniting. His face lit up with a mischievous grin, and before I knew it, he was heading for the door. I hated this, but out of concern, I reluctantly followed him. We snuck out of our apartment and headed up to the third floor. I stayed back to lock the door before leaving. Charlie was already going up the stairs. I caught a glimpse of him.
Charlie, please stop, don't.
When I reached the top, I saw Charlie standing outside Mr. Huns' apartment, his right hand on the doorbell.
Charlie, what the heck? Stop it!
Without warning, Charlie turned to me and said,
Get ready to run. All right, run.
We bolted down the stairs like our lives depended on it.
Who's there?
I heard Mr. Huns stepping out of his apartment. Then the door slammed shut behind us, and we could hear his footsteps coming closer and closer. We gasped for breath, panicking as we ran down the hallway. Reaching my door, Charlie began to freak out, and I broke into a sweat when I realized I didn't have the keys. Charlie yanked me into a dimly lit storage room at the end of the hall. We crouched behind a pile of boxes, trying to make ourselves as small as possible so he wouldn't see us. Minutes passed as we carefully listened to the diminishing sound of footsteps, fading into near silence. We thought he had left and sighed in relief. Just as we turned the corner in the hallway, a few seconds later, I felt something was off. Suddenly, I was grabbed by the collar from behind. Charlie was walking ahead of me, so who was behind me? I slowly turned my head to look, and it was him. He had a firm grip on my shirt, and my feet were no longer touching the ground. Then, he lifted me into the air. Charlie froze, his mind spinning. Too scared, he ran away and left me there. I felt like I was being suffocated by his strength. The man leaned in close to my face and said,
Hey kid, you messed with the wrong person.
In my despair, as my vision began to blur, I saw Charlie coming back. He moved silently, like a shadow, sneaking up behind the man. He was signaling to me. I understood and started struggling against the man to distract him. Taking advantage of the man's distraction, Charlie kicked the back of his knee, causing him to stumble and lose balance, making me fall to the ground as well. Seizing the opportunity, we escaped right then and there. Once we were outside the apartment, everything would be over. Reaching the first floor, Charlie ran to the emergency exit and banged on it, but it seemed to be locked. Realizing that we might not escape, just then, the door opened from the outside. A woman was there, asking what we were doing. I heard his footsteps growing fainter. Perhaps we had escaped. When we got back home, Charlie and I were punished. Later, he showed me a newspaper article featuring Mr. Huns. He was a former patient, someone abnormal ever since his wife had gone missing and could not be found. Despite many efforts, they couldn't find his wife. When they searched his house, instead of food in his pantry, they found jars filled with dead bugs. Many speculated that they were his food, but I think this is enough. We won't dig any deeper. In the end, perhaps we should be more cautious with our jokes and thoughts to avoid bad consequences.
Intruder on Halloween. The clock ticks softly, its sound nearly drowned out by the eerie music playing on the TV. Colorful costumes and decorations adorn the walls, remnants of the Halloween festival. Tonight, like every year, I was going trick or treating with my best friend, Casey. Excitement filled the air as we stuffed our bags with candy, the weight of our haul increasing after each house we visited. The streets were filled with laughter and the sound of children running from house to house. As we walked, we noticed a man standing near a lamppost. He wore a mask and held a flickering lantern. His eyes seemed to follow us as we passed by, sending a chill down my spine. I glanced at Casey, and we quickened our pace. We continued our journey, laughing and screaming as we collected treats, but occasionally, I caught a glimpse of the masked man lingering just out of reach. It felt like he was watching us. At one house, while we were busy stuffing our bags, I turned around and saw him standing on the street, intently watching us. I yelled at Casey to get away, that we needed to run fast from there. We hurried to the front door of the house we were at and knocked frantically. The homeowner opened the door. We explained that there was a scary man outside. The couple looked worried and ushered us inside for safety as the masked man moved further down the street. After a few minutes, we saw the masked man had left, and we thought we could leave the house now. Just as we thought we had escaped, I spotted him hiding behind a tree, waving at us. Panic flooded me. He only backed away when an adult threatened to call the police. After walking a few more blocks, we crossed a small wooden bridge over the river. The night air was fresh and cool, but a sense of unease washed over me as a black Jeep stopped on the other side. The driver leaned out the window. A spooky man wearing a pumpkin mask called out to us in a gravelly voice. "We need directions," he shouted. I felt a bit suspicious and distrustful of this man, so I declined and we kept moving. The Jeep couldn't cross the bridge, so we had to drive away. But just when we thought we were safe, a long time later, an SUV screeched around the corner of the bridge and stopped right in front of us. The window rolled down, revealing a man who was probably someone else, but he was also wearing the same mask. Then he said, "Get in the car, and they have free bags of candy," the man shouted, his voice filled with manipulation. My heart raced as I glanced at Casey. We turned back to running when I heard the car roar again. The man started to get out of the car. We just ran as fast as we could to the house because we were almost home. We finally arrived home. My mother left for work, so it was just the two of us at home. Tonight, Casey slept at my house to stay safe. Every second passed as I looked out the window uneasily at that man in the pumpkin mask. The memory of the Jeep, everything was still in my mind. Mine. The streets were pitch black, darkness stretching over the sidewalk. I held my phone, staring at the screen, hoping to distract myself from the rising anxiety within. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A message from Casey. What if they come back? I glanced at her, but she was still peacefully asleep, unaware of the tension suffocating the room. I cautiously approached the window and peered through the curtains. My heart skipped a beat. The black Jeep was parked outside my house. I whispered urgently, shaking Casey awake. Casey's eyes flew open in fear. We both sat up, listening intently. The engine roared, and I could see a shadow moving inside the Jeep. My pulse quickened, and I knew we had to act and come up with a plan. I whispered, "If he comes in, we have to trap that man." We gathered supplies, a heavy chair, some rope from my dad's toolbox, and my phone, so I could call for help if needed. We figured we could block the door if he came in, trapping him inside. Casey nodded, and we hurriedly propped the chair against the door, tying it tightly with the rope. We were ready and positioned behind the chair, preparing for anything that might happen. Through the glass, I saw the masked man standing by the front door, his shadow ominously stretching. My heart raced as he knocked, the sound echoing like thunder in the silence of the night. Suddenly, I saw the man step back, turn around and walk towards the Jeep. I watched in horror as another figure stepped out of the car, both wearing masks and dark clothes. My mind is racing now. There are two people, I whispered. Fumbling for my phone, "Casey, we need to call the police." Fear gripped me, knowing our trap might only buy us a little time to escape safely. But before I could dial, I heard footsteps approaching the house. The doorknob rattled, and my heart raced. The masked man yelled something indistinct, and I felt panic rise. "They're trying to get in," I said, gripping Casey's arm tightly. I heard them banging on the door, trying to break it down. The chair held for now, but I knew it wouldn't last long. "Call the police," I shouted, but Casey was frozen in fear, her eyes wide. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I whispered, "We need to run, and when they break in, Casey and I will head for the back door." With a loud crash, the chair toppled over. The door swung open. The masked man charged into the living room, followed by another figure. I slowly crawled toward the door, then grabbed Casey's hand, and we ran toward the back door, quietly escaping the intruders. We bolted out into the backyard and ran toward the fence. Behind us, I heard the men shouting. I shouted for Casey to climb over the fence. I thought we still had hope and needed to seize this chance to try to get over. As things grew urgent, I started to climb up, but unfortunately for me, one of them came outside and managed to grab and pull my leg. I flailed and kicked at his face, but it didn't seem to matter. It didn't faze him at all. I fell painfully to the ground. I looked in agony as Casey cried in fear by the fence on the other side. I screamed for her to run. I would follow, but she seemed too scared, worried for my safety. I lay in pain, watching him grin grotesquely. He taunted me, saying trick or treat, and waved at Casey playfully, enjoying our fear. I reassured myself that I needed to escape and survive. I slowly, secretly grabbed the ice and stood up to answer his question as if I was pretending to play with him. I took candy out of my pocket and said I wouldn't run away. I asked if he wanted a piece of candy. He seemed surprised and didn't notice as I threw the rock at his face. He fell, screaming in pain, and his friend came out from the house, witnessing it. He also yelled in anger. I didn't think much, trying to use the remaining strength to climb over the fence to escape. Just as we were about to escape, I heard the distant sound of a siren. I felt relieved. The police were coming. I headed toward the front yard to meet them. When we reached the front yard, the flashing lights of the police car lit up the street. The officers ran toward us, and I pointed at the men trying to flee back to the Jeep. "They're over there," I shouted, and the police sprang into action, chasing after them. Within minutes, the police had apprehended the masked men. Back inside the house, my mom rushed in, just returning home. She pulled us into a tight hug, relief evident on her face. Casey and I exchanged glances. We were finally the outcome of the Hitchhiker Man. I was working the third shift at a 24/7 diner in a quiet town. Most of our customers were truck drivers and travelers passing through. But the strangest people I've ever met were the drifters, addicts, and hitchhikers. That night started like any other. Carl, the cook, had been working at this place for over 15 years, and he had seen it all. His sharp eyes could spot trouble from a mile away. We were perfectly in sync. I served tables, and he flipped burgers. With a new cast in the pipeline, and he flipped burgers. Around 4 a.m., the shift was well underway. The place was completely silent, not a single person in sight. The only sound breaking the silence was the hum of the old refrigerator. Suddenly, the door creaked open. A man stumbled in, clutching his right arm to his chest. He didn't say a word, just shuffled past Carl and me, heading straight to the bathroom. His clothes were torn and filthy, and his face was twisted in pain. Carl and I exchanged glances. We'd seen strange customers before, but there was something off about this guy, more than just a regular drifter. I asked Carl, "Doesn't he look familiar?" After a moment, I remembered. That guy had come in before, begging for food and a ride. We had to kick him out because he was bothering the customers. But now, something had changed. He looked panicked, like he had seen something terrifying. Carl just shook his head, muttering, "Here we go again." I looked at the bathroom door. I didn't want to check on him, but I didn't have much choice. Carl handed me the keys, nodding toward the bathroom. "Go check if he's all right." I knocked on the door, asking if he needed help, but there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time. Still, nothing. I called out, fumbling with the keys. I pushed the door open, saying I was coming in. The bathroom was empty. No trace of the man. No dirt, no blood, nothing. The bathroom was as clean as the night before. I froze at the doorway. "End and year and ye and Andra." I screamed for Carl. He rushed over. I backed away as he pushed past me, staring into the spotless room with wide, disbelieving eyes. We stood behind the counter, both of us trying to make sense of what had just happened. How could he have disappeared? I looked at Carl, but he had the same horrified expression as I did. Then I saw movement near the front window. The man was outside, staring at us. His face was worse than before, bloody, swollen, and his eyes were bleeding. But what froze me in place was how his right hand hung limply at his side, looking like it was about to snap off. His thumb was sticking straight up, unnaturally stiff, as if he was trying to hitch a ride. Before I could grab the phone to call 911, a loud noise echoed from the back of the diner. Carl and I rushed to the back. It was coming from the freezer. Someone was tearing into the food boxes. Carl grabbed a knife from the counter, and we slowly moved in. The man was inside, tearing open a box of frozen meatballs and pressing a pile of meat against his arm, like he was possessed. But his arm, it wasn't right. His hand was dangling, almost detached from his wrist. For a moment, everything went still. We locked eyes on him, witnessing something we couldn't believe. Then, at an unnatural speed, he bolted past us, kicked the kitchen door open, and ran outside. Carl and I stood there, too shocked to react. We had just witnessed the impossible. Carl hurried to the front, locked the diner doors, and turned off the lights, plunging the place into darkness. The only light now came from the neon sign outside, casting a dim red glow on the counter. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, my hands trembling. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. That man, if he was really injured, was moving with an unnatural speed and strength. And those eyes, it was like something else was controlling him. When I looked out the window, the parking lot was empty. There was no sign of the man. Carl stood with me, his face tense, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. I asked Carl what we should do now, and if we should call the police. Carl shook his head and said they wouldn't believe us, and there was no way to explain this. He reconsidered, slowly walking to the phone and picking up the receiver. But just as he dialed 911, the lights in the diner flickered. The hum of the refrigerator went silent, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, in the darkness, we heard a soft, slow tapping on the window. We bolted through the kitchen, with Carl leading the way. I glanced back just in time to see the glass shatter, and the man crawling through the window like a wild animal. Carl pushed open the back door, and we stumbled out into the alley behind the diner. Carl panted, glancing around. "We need to get to the car." We sprinted down the alley, the man's footsteps echoing behind us. He was faster than I expected, his heavy breathing growing louder as he closed in on us. I could hear his raspy voice muttering something, words I couldn't quite make out. Carl reached the car, fumbling with the keys, urging me to get in quickly as the doors unlocked. I yanked the door open and jumped inside just as Carl started the engine. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the man standing at the end of the alley. Now he was covered in blood, his smile wider as he slowly raised his thumb again, rigid and grotesque, like a hitchhiker's signal. Tires screeched as Carl slammed on the gas, and the truck sped out of the alley and onto the road. I glanced into the rear-view mirror, my heart still racing. The man stood motionless at the edge of the diner, watching us disappear into the night. We didn't speak for the first few miles, both of us too stunned to process what had just happened. We drove in silence for the next hour, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and that place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I eventually called the police to report the incident. To my surprise, they told us to head toward a location near the diner. They confirmed that a man matching that description had been reported. A man had been killed in a hit and run accident near the ramp, not far from the diner. As I got closer, I saw it. It was the same man. His body lay by the roadside, his clothes covered in dirt. But the eeriest part was his right hand, still holding that thumb up, just like before. According to the report, the man had survived the initial accident earlier that night and had been able to walk. His desperate search for help led him to our diner before he collapsed on the road. But there was more to the story. It turned out that this man had been involved in a series of violent incidents years earlier, hitchhiking across states and attacking those who picked him up. The police pieced together his history, a fugitive, infamous for attacking victims and vanishing into the night. The accident had broken his body, but it didn't kill him immediately. He had stumbled into the diner, seeking refuge, only to return to the streets, where he was eventually found dead. The police said he had been trying to use his injury to manipulate others. We were lucky to have escaped him. As I stood in the parking lot, staring at the diner, everything started to make sense. The man wasn't a ghost. He was real. Maybe he had finally paid the price in the same way he had hurt others on the road. That was where his twisted journey had come to an end. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in the faint glow of streetlights. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and the eerie quiet surrounded it. The night was still, until a soft tapping on the glass echoed in the darkness. I was the night shift manager here. Usually, things were calm, and nothing happened. It was just me, stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the outside world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken when I heard the faint tapping. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart and headed toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. He was leaning against the glass, trying to peer inside. His clothes were tattered, his face expressionless, with a hollow, vacant look in his eyes. He saw me the moment I came into view. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was emotionless, no hint of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and that he couldn't be here. As I turned to walk away, a loud bang startled me. The man's fists were pounding on the glass, over and over, each strike louder and angrier than the last. My heart raced. This guy wasn't just a harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, showing him I was ready to call the police. Only then did he back off, his eyes still locked on me, filled with rage. Slowly, he stepped back into the shadows of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to focus back on my work. 15 minutes passed. The tapping, the pounding, the man, all of it faded from my mind as I immersed myself in stocking the shelves. But then I heard it, the sound of metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned the stroller and ran forward, fear rising. My heart sank when I saw the glass door slightly open. The lock, the only thing that kept the door secure, was missing. Fear gripped me as I realized what this meant. I need to go to the office, call the police now. I turned to run for the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was the man. His expression hadn't changed, still cold, still lifeless, filled with rage. I don't think anything. I just run. I burst through the door, the man right behind me. Suddenly, a beat-up van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved dangerously, nearly hitting me as it stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything flipped upside down. A sharp pain suddenly exploded at the back of my head. My body lurched forward as I fell to the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before the world started fading. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold pavement. My vision blurred, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the van's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up with a throbbing headache, my wrists tightly bound behind me. The van bounced and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came rushing back. I started to string it together. Man, the truck. Perhaps I was kidnapped by him. My heart raced as I realized I needed to act, and fast. I glanced around. Inside, it was pitch black, but I could make out a pile of old tools, a rusted toolbox, and some scattered metal pieces on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I could hear the driver muttering to himself up front. His voice was low, angry. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the panic rising inside me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I inched closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was hard, but I found a small, jagged piece of rusted metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, rubbing the metal against the ropes. My heart pounded with every noise the van made, every bump in the road that might expose me, each one painful enough to make me want to scream. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scratches and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced toward the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake yet. I noticed the door latch wasn't locked. I needed a plan. The van slowed as it made a sharp turn onto a dirt road. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the back door open, and jumped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my body as I tumbled over dirt and gravel. For a second, I thought I wouldn't be able to move, but adrenaline surged through me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the trees. Behind me, the van screeched to a stop. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees, the branches, scratched at my skin as I tore through the dense underbrush. My mind was foggy, teetering between fear and survival. I could hear the man crashing through the forest behind me, his breath heavy and furious. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could get there fast, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, waving my arms frantically as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed against the hood, gasping for breath. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to answer. All I could do was whisper, "Help me." The driver pulled out his phone, calling the police. I glanced back at the man. He stood at the edge of the woods, staring at me with cold, furious eyes. But he didn't come any closer. He knew it was over. The flashing lights of police cars lit up the dark road. Officers surrounded the van. The man already in handcuffs not far away. His face was cold, blank, disturbingly empty. I sat on the curb, still trembling, wrapped in a blanket the police had given me. The world felt strange, like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. But I was grateful, lucky to be alive. I was free. The police assured me that he'd be locked away, that he wouldn't hurt anyone else. But the thought still lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I stood by the car, watching the police take the man away. The fear was still there, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to survive the night shift. Mysterious man at the fast food restaurant. I had been working at this 24-hour fast food restaurant for years. Most of my night shifts were quiet. However, tonight was different. The night started like any normal shift, nothing out of the ordinary. Our night cook called in sick, leaving me to manage the whole restaurant alone until someone could assist at 4 a.m. The silence in the restaurant was eerie. With no customers around, I spent time cleaning the kitchen, focusing on scrubbing away the grime. Then, I heard a loud noise coming from the front of the restaurant. There was a man outside the entrance. He was standing there, his face pressed against the glass, peering inside and banging on the door. He didn't seem normal, which made me feel uneasy. The door was locked. I approached the glass, trying to stay calm, and gestured for him to go around to the drive-thru. He didn't respond, just stared. I shouted through the glass that the dining area was closed, but he didn't move, just stood there, lifeless. I turned and went back to the kitchen. I tried to continue working, focusing on my tasks. 15 minutes passed, and I convinced myself that he must have left. But the unease still lingered. A beep went off in my headset. Someone had placed an order. I turned on the mic and asked for their order, but all I got was silence. I checked the camera at the drive-thru lane, no car, no sign of anyone. I sighed and turned away, but then I froze. I heard something footsteps, light, careful steps coming from above, as if someone was walking on the roof. I tracked the noise until it stopped at the ladder leading to the maintenance door in the ceiling. The footsteps halted above. I was sure someone was up there. I quickly searched for a lock or anything to secure the door. I had never used it before, so I wasn't sure if it could even lock. I heard the trapdoor creak. It was slowly beginning to open. A small gap appeared, and through it, I saw a pair of cold, unblinking eyes staring at me. Panic consumed me, and without thinking, I turned and ran toward the front door. I bolted outside to my car, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. Trembling, I called the police and described what was happening. From the safety of my car, I glanced back at the restaurant, my eyes scanning the windows, and then I saw him. A shadow moving near the counter. For a moment, he looked directly at me, then suddenly darted into the kitchen. The police arrived and searched the entire building, inside and out, even checking the roof. But the man had vanished, disappeared as if he had never been there. Nothing was stolen. No money, no equipment, nothing was missing. He had broken in, but he didn't take anything from the restaurant, like a strange stalker. After the police left, I sat in my car, staring at the darkened restaurant. My mind kept replaying the moment I saw him look at me in such a strange and unsettling way. I went back to work. My boss had installed a lock on the ceiling door, a safety measure that should have been done long ago. But my job was never the same. From then on, I startled at every sound, never knowing if he would come back. Underground parking and mysterious people. I worked the night shift at an apartment complex downtown. The job seemed simple enough: monitor cameras, patrol, and ensure the building's security. The building was constructed in the late 60s, and its design left many vulnerable entry points in the parking garage. The association was concerned about security, especially with the occasional break-ins and homeless people finding shelter in the hidden corners of the basement. I had worked here for months, and every night I would check every nook and cranny. Most nights were quiet, normal, even boring. Until tonight. I walked through the dimly lit parking garage, my footsteps echoing. The place was a maze of dead spaces and blind spots. Too many places to hide. Too many areas the cameras couldn't see. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing only parked cars and empty spaces. I always hated the door that led to a dead-end hallway. It was an isolated corridor that led nowhere, just a locked door that couldn't be opened from the inside, as if it held some history better left unknown. As I approached the door, it was wide open. A cold wave of fear washed over me. The door was supposed to be locked tight. I swept my flashlight down the narrow hallway. There was nothing, just an empty glass bottle lying on the ground. My anxiety spiked. The thought of stepping into the hallway made me uneasy. I didn't want to get trapped in there, especially knowing the door locked from the outside. But procedure is procedure. I had to follow it, and I couldn't just leave the bottle there. Reluctantly, I stepped inside. I moved toward the bottle, my flashlight reflecting off the cold gray walls. Each step felt heavier than the last. I bent down, picked up the bottle, and stood up. But then, the sound that chilled me to the bone, the door slammed shut behind me. I rushed to the door, panic rising in my chest, and grabbed the handle. It was locked. I pounded on the metal door, screaming for help, but the thick concrete walls swallowed my cries. My heart raced as I realized no one was coming. It was 3 a.m. and I was trapped. I tried my phone, no signal. The thick walls and metal door blocked everything. I was completely cut off from the outside world. I leaned against the cold wall, trying to calm myself down. The flashlight was my only lifeline in the stifling darkness. I switched it off to save the battery, but I could still hear echoes from somewhere. Then the sound of car alarms blared, one after the other. Whoever had locked me in was out there, doing whatever they wanted, smashing car doors, stealing whatever they could. After what felt like hours, I heard footsteps. It was a miracle. Someone was out there, and I had to make them hear me. I pounded on the door with all my strength, shouting loudly. Finally, a deep, raspy voice answered from the other side, and after a moment, the lock clicked. The door opened, and I felt a wave of relief. A passerby, on their way to work early, had heard my banging. I thanked them profusely as I stumbled out of the hallway, my legs shaking, but my relief didn't last long. As I returned to the basement, chaos greeted me. Windows were shattered, glass littered the concrete floor. At least a dozen cars had been broken into, valuable items stolen. Whoever locked me in knew exactly what they were doing. They had silenced the alarms after each car was hit, leaving behind damage worth tens of thousands of dollars. My heart sank. I knew what was coming next. When the morning shift arrived and the residents discovered the theft, the police would be called, and I would be fired. Security had been breached under my watch, and though it wasn't my fault, I was the one held responsible. Weeks later, after I had quit, the mystery still haunted me. I replayed the events of that night over and over in my head. How did they know exactly where to trap me? How did they avoid the cameras so perfectly? No one was ever caught. The footage showed nothing, just me, doing my rounds. As I walked, I didn't see a thing. Maybe they knew the blind spots of the place too well. Months had passed, but tonight, that phone call pulled me back to the core of everything. I walked into the parking garage. I approached the dead-end hallway, my heart pounding harder with every step. The door was ajar, just like that night. I could feel the weight of the past pressing on me, daring me to confront it. There was something I missed before. I stood at the entrance, staring, then cautiously moved forward as my senses sharpened. This time, I was ready for whatever I might face. No more running. Then I saw him. It was probably the man who trapped me. His gaunt face was pale and dirty, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He stood still, almost like a statue, as if he had been waiting for me all this time. A chill ran down my spine. The man wasn't a ghost or a specter, he was real. My voice trembled as I spoke. "Who are you? Why did you do this?" The man didn't move at first, but then, slowly, a twisted smile spread across his face, growing wider. He started walking toward me. He started saying something I didn't understand, talking about how I would soon see for myself the secret of this place, the truth I had been afraid of and running from. He said he wasn't just some random drifter that night, and that he had been here much longer than I thought. This building, this place, it wasn't just concrete and steel. It was a prison, and people like him, they were trapped inside. For a moment, his expression darkened. He told me that there are things in this world that feed on fear and suffering. And places like this, they are where they hunt. Now, he was part of its cycle. My mind raced as I tried to understand what he was saying. The truth hit me, and I realized this man wasn't just some random criminal. He was a victim of something much darker, something that had taken hold of him and was now trying to take me too. I stepped back, my heart pounding. "I'm not like you. I can still get out of this." His smile widened again, sinister and mocking. I turned, glancing at the door, thinking about running. I clenched my fists, took one last look at the man, then turned and sprinted toward the door. I could hear his laughter echoing behind me, filling the narrow hallway. I ran through the parking garage, then stopped. Standing there, in the darkness, was another figure, identical to the man in the hallway. I froze. This couldn't be happening. More figures appeared, stepping out from the shadows. Each one looked just like him, pale, gaunt. Maybe they weren't real, but they felt so real, their malicious energy surrounding me. I staggered. That man hadn't been lying. This place, this building, it was still alive. It had taken him, just as it had taken others before him. And now it was my turn. But I wasn't going to let that happen. With one last surge of strength, I got up and ran, not stopping until I was far away from the building, the figures fading into the night behind me. I didn't look back. Safe in my apartment, I sat in the dark, the truth of that night still sinking in. The man, the building. I had escaped, but deep down I knew it wouldn't be that simple. I needed to stay far away from that place and never go back.